factors such as race, gender, disability, and poverty. Sierra Leone is continually refining its policies and programs to ensure they accurately reflect the nation's complexities and foster a more inclusive environment for all. Through our radical inclusion policy in education, we are helping girls, children with disabilities, and other vulnerable groups access equal opportunities. We also share the SR's concerns about the glorification of Nazism, hate speech, and attacks on racial and religious minorities. Sierra Leone condemns all forms of racial and religious hatred and remains committed to promoting peace, tolerance, and inclusion. As a post-conflict country, we understand the dangers of identity-based violence and work hard to prevent it through education and community dialogue. We recognize that implementing intersectional approaches and countering hate are ongoing challenges, especially for developing countries. We call for stronger international support and cooperation to build necessary institutions and capacity, and I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. And I give the floor to the plurinational state of Bolivia. Please go ahead. Thank you, Madam Vice President. We're grateful to the Special Rapporteur for her report, focused on intersectionality from the perspective of racial justice. We agree with the importance of adopting an intersectional approach when it comes to combating systemic discrimination and racism, rather. Intersectionality makes it possible to make visible how the two interplay, highlighting how certain people tackle issues of discrimination that are more complicated and more severe in nature, and to understand how the domination structures are propped up. We agree that the intersectional approach can make it possible for the identification of and the dismantling of privilege and power structures, which often are the outcome, for example, of colonialism and patriarchy. Both systems are interconnected and produce marginalization, repression, and they currently exist today, which is why in Bolivia we speak of the need to work on the process of decolonization and depatriarchalization, which must be present in our minds when we draft laws on education and state plans and policies inter alia, to make progress towards transformation of social structures, whilst recognizing the importance for us to respect diversity, justice, and equity. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. I now give the floor to Ecuador. Thank you, Madam Vice President. We're grateful to the Special Rapporteur for her report and agree that all states should scale up their efforts to effectively enforce laws and policies they have to combat discrimination and ensure that intersectional discrimination is taken into account fully in what the state does. We in Ecuador recognize the legal value and the transforming nature in the intersectional approach. Our constitution embodies a collective rights regime which recognizes cultural diversity, cultural, linguistic, and organizational of peoples and nationalities. Indigenous peoples and nationalities are also Afro-Ecuadorian and Montubes. Our laws criminalize racial crimes, including physical violence or psychological violence on the grounds of nationality, ethnic origin, place of birth, age, inter alia. We also have an active range of institutions, which includes the Department for the Management and Development of Peoples and Nationalities and the National Council for Equality for Peoples and Nationalities. The intersectional approach also leads what we do in the multilateral field in the area of human rights. We're actively involved in the follow-up mechanism of the DDPA, and we support the normative development of law on the rights of persons of African descent. Our question to you would be, how can we strengthen international cooperation to ensure that intersectional approaches give rise to concrete measures to help states to combat racism? Thank you very much indeed.
Embajador, a continuación.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Ambassador of Guatemala, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. We are grateful to the Special Rapporteur for her report. Guatemala is aware that racism and racial discrimination are social phenomena that have political, economic, and cultural dimensions which go beyond the ability of states to act because they do not recognize boundaries and continue to affect people, especially indigenous peoples, migrants, and persons who are disadvantaged. And this despite national efforts, regional and global efforts, which highlights the fact that racism and racial discrimination continue to be a threat to the power of the state to eradicate them. In the light of all of this, to combat racial discrimination, well, we states need to demonstrate determination and find new ways to guarantee the right to non-discrimination and equality. Guatemala is made up of a multi-ethnic and multicultural peoples, which is why I recognize that the promoting the full participation and contribution of our peoples for them to work, to live in peace within our borders is fundamental, which is why we need to achieve sustainable development. Under the administration of President Mariano Arevalo, Guatemala is today prioritizing strategies and establishing important partnerships in order to embody in our processes to plan and develop national policies, elements which will contribute to the elimination of racism, xenophobia, racial discrimination, in order to achieve the SDGs. We need to tackle the deep causes of racism and all forms of racial discrimination, and leave no one behind. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, embajador. A continuación, la...
Thank you. Italy, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Italy aligns itself with the EU statement. Last March, we celebrated the 60th anniversary of the adoption of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which marked a major step forward in the global fight to eradicate racism. Since Italy's accession to the Convention in 1975, the fight against all forms of discrimination has been an integral part of our commitment to protect and promote human rights, also in compliance with the Italian Constitution. In this regard, Italy has accepted many of the recommendations formulated during the fourth UPR cycle concerning contemporary forms of racism and xenophobia, including by adopting the new National Plan Against Racism, Xenophobia and Intolerance on June 12th. The plan, developed with the National Office Against Racial Discrimination, focuses on preventing and addressing discrimination and inequalities, and on enhancing social cohesion across key areas like work, housing, education, health, security, justice and media. Specific actions have been defined, including training of public officials and awareness campaigns. Italy remains steadfast in the fight against all forms of discrimination, standing for inclusion and respect for every individual. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. And I give the floor to the delegation of Spain.
Señora Vicepresidenta.
Madam Vice President, Spain supports what was said by the EU and thanks the Special Rapporteur for her reports. We agree with you in the need to combat discrimination by using an intersectional approach because racism and other forms of intolerance affect concretely racialized women, Afro-descendant women, migrant women, and our public policies must be geared towards the concrete needs of these women. We consider that true equality means that we must adopt public policies that are anti-racist and proactive and bring about structural changes as well to bring about social inclusion and recognition of historically marginalized communities. This is precisely the spirit of our Law 15/2022 on the equality of treatment and non-discrimination and the strategic framework on citizenship and inclusion against racism and xenophobia governing the period 2023-2027, which focuses especially on the Gypsy or Gitano community and Afro-descendants. In addition to this, in 2020, the Spanish Observatory on Racism and Xenophobia, Oberache, contributes to this work of monitoring hate speech and on social networks, social media. Internationally, Spain combats racism and racial discrimination and xenophobia using effective multilateralism, tackling challenges such as inequality and disinformation, and anti-social convention on the administration of all forms of racial discrimination. CERT remains our cornerstone of what we do. Madam Special Rapporteur, how can we prevent the use of digital platforms when they're being used to propagate xenophobia, racism, and intolerant speech, and a call for accountability? Thank you very much. Pakistan, you have the floor.
Madam Vice President, we thank the SR for presenting her report. We remain deeply concerned over increasing manifestations of racism and underline the need to confront it globally. The unabated rise in racial discrimination, Islamophobia, and religious hatred are reprehensible manifestations that germinate from ingrained and systemic racist attitudes. Pakistan has been cautioning this Council regarding the alarming rise in anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobic narrative in India. Emerging as the crucible of hate-laden ideologies and disinformation, the Indian state-sponsored venom against Muslims is no longer restricted to occupied Kashmir or in India. Notably, this collusion of mainstream media and the state was most visible when those vilifying a visiting foreign minister of a Muslim state were not even put off air let alone booked under criminal charges. The recent hubris-inspired cross-border attacks against innocent civilians and deliberate targeting of mosques in Pakistan were emblematic of the larger malaise that runs through this hate-filled polity. On the other hand, those who even make a whimper in occupied Jammu and Kashmir against this racist, exclusionary policy of the Indian occupation regime are subjected to the most brutal application of arbitrary laws. Madam Special Rapporteur, we welcome your views on how politics of hatred and racist ideologies transcend borders, threaten regional stability, and risk the enjoyment of human rights of all those who inhabit our region. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. I now give the floor to the delegation of Cameroon.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam President. Cameroon aligns itself with the statement made by Ghana on behalf of the African Group. My delegation thanks the Special Rapporteur for her report, focused on the glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism and other forms of extremism which promote racism, xenophobia and intolerance. We confirm the principle of equality and mutual respect. We firmly condemn all manifestations of racism, doctrines based on hatred. We welcome the structured approach adopted in the report, which focuses on persons who are vulnerable of multiple forms of discrimination, in particular women and ethnic and religious minorities. Cameron calls upon us all to strengthen education in history, in particular for young people, and to use digital platforms and the opportunities offered by them. In this spirit, we encourage international cooperation, which is bolstered to combat all forms of racism and to prevent ideologies which promote hatred. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. And I give the floor to the delegation of Namibia.
Madam Vice President, Namibia aligns itself with the statement of the Africa Group. Namibia welcomes the report of the Special Rapporteur and agrees that neo-Nazism and related racism, xenophobia and intolerance are complex, multifaceted and pervasive. Unfortunately, since commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the ICED, millions of people around the world continue to suffer from severe forms of racism, xenophobia and related intolerance. Madam Vice President, racial discrimination is prohibited in Namibia. Specifically, the Racial Discrimination Prohibition Act and Article 23 of the Namibian Constitution prohibits all acts and practices of racial discrimination and apartheid. Namibia strongly condemns the racial injustices and racially motivated violence being perpetuated against people of African descent worldwide. To conclude, Namibia takes note of the submissions that the Special Rapporteur received from states and other stakeholders and supports the recommendations reflected in the report. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. I therefore would now give the floor to Eritrea.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We thank the Special Rapporteur and take note of her report. We always welcome this dialogue, but we believe it is imperative that we hold frank discussions. These conversations, year after year, often sound the same. We denounce racism, discrimination, and all forms of intolerance. We reaffirm our commitments, and yet we have very little to show for it. We live in a time when we are witnessing attempts to eliminate entire populations. We live in a time when still today Black women across Western countries face a higher risk of dying from childbirth due to medical negligence. We live in a world where people fleeing wars are being treated like second-class citizens in their destination countries. These are the facts. The gaps between our declarations and our actions are glaring. Many of the processes we discussed today, programs, action plans, consultations, working groups, have been ongoing for decades. But communities continue to experience racism not as a theoretical concept, but as a daily lived reality. It is disingenuous to continue speaking in the same tone, often recycling old commitments without accountability, measurable outcomes, or centering those most affected. The work that needs to be done is not ambiguous. It has been clearly outlined by all of us, as well as by this body, through numerous UN reports. If we are serious about dismantling systematic racism, we must stop relying on rhetorical performance and start matching words with real actions. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. And now give the floor to Kuwait. You have the floor.
السيدة نائبة الرئيس يأخذ وفد بلادي علما.
Thank you, Madam President. We take note of the report from the Special Rapporteur and the recommendations contained in it as concerns discrimination, racial discrimination and politics of exclusion. We are committed to combating racial discrimination and hate speech in line with Article 29 of our Constitution and our institutional and legislative framework, and in line with our international commitments as stipulated in the international human rights treaties we are party to. As is mentioned in the report, we are seeing an increase in systemic racial discrimination against the Palestinian people within the occupied Palestinian territory and outside this. There's targeting of those who defend their rights, and including those who are in solidarity with the Palestinian people, are sometimes characterized as propagating hate speech. So our question is as follows: what are the mechanisms which could be activated by this Council to guarantee effective protection of persons whose rights are violated, and to make sure there's accountability for those who use legal or political means to quieten them and to keep them silent and to criminalize solidarity? Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished Ambassador of Albania.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Albania thanks the Special Rapporteur for her report. We note with concern a global increase in cases of discrimination, intolerance and violence motivated by Islamophobia, anti-Semitism and Christianophobia, which directly affect the enjoyment of human rights and threaten religious harmony and coexistence. We welcome the Special Rapporteur's recommendation, particularly those related to the need to intensify awareness-raising and educational efforts, particularly among young people, strengthen mechanisms for regulated online content, and promote tolerance, respect for human rights and diversity. Nationally, we have successfully implemented vigorous policies to prevent and combat all forms and manifestations of racism, xenophobia and intolerance, adopting appropriate legislation, establishing national independent institutions to prevent and combat this phenomenon. In concrete terms, the Albanian Commission for Protection Against Discrimination plays a key role in preventing and combating discrimination. We recognize that challenges remain. Albania remains committed to strengthening its legislative framework and institutional mechanism to combat all forms of discrimination. Finally, Albania expresses its commitment to fully cooperate with national, regional and international mechanisms and institutions to build a world free from racism and intolerance. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador. And I give the floor to the delegation of Costa Rica. You have the floor. Thank you, Madam Vice President. We thank the Rapporteur for her report and welcome in particular her intersectional approach proposed from the perspective of racial justice. My country restates its commitment to the principles of equality and non-discrimination enshrined in international human rights law and highlights efforts made to guarantee equitable access to rights by our peoples, namely Afro-descendants, indigenous and migrant peoples. We have currently been organizing information workshops on the development of national strategy for a society free of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, whose purpose is to communicate the path to follow after the conclusion of our national policy for a society free of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia 2014-2025, which has led to our national strategy, which will update a number of the aspects of the general guidelines, management models and assessment of the existing policies. Thus, we are seeking to ensure that what the state does is cross-cutting as it seeks to combat racism and racial discrimination by promoting the realization of human rights for all our peoples and using a cultural diversity perspective, but also based on equality and gender equality, accessibility and sustainable development to ensure that our society becomes more inclusive and equitable. We support the Special Rapporteur when she calls for us to interpret coherently existing international instruments to include the obligation to combat discrimination intersectionally. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, says the Vice President. I give the floor to Benin.
Madam President, the delegation of Benin thanks the Special Rapporteur for her report and aligns itself with the African Group statement. As underscored in the report, an intersectional approach is vital to fully understand and combat systemic racism and multiple forms of discrimination, oppression and marginalization. In Benin, we have rich cultural and ethnic diversity, and our constitution guarantees equality before the law for all, with no distinction to origin, race, and so on, and it recognizes the same rights for foreigners resident in our territory. And in this spirit, we adopted in 2024 a law recognizing the citizenship of Benin for Afro-descendants. And as a party to different international instruments to combat racial discrimination, including ICERD, we had the pleasure of presenting our initial report in August 2022. We renew our commitment to the DDPA. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. I recognize the delegation of Kenya.
Entiendo que no están en sala.
It appears that Kenya is not in the room, so may I give the floor to Belarus?
Este fue entonces el último.
This was the last speaker we could accommodate. We now move on to our national human rights institutions speakers and NGOs also. In this connection, I first give the floor for a joint statement to the World Jewish Congress. Please go ahead.
Madam President, the World Jewish Congress addresses this Council with deep concern. Anti-Semitism has surged alarmingly since October 7, 2023, manifesting in increasingly visible and violent ways across many societies. Synagogues have been attacked. Jewish children are not longer safe in Jewish schools. Hatred against members of our community is too often excused as a political expression. It is not. It is vile anti-Semitism. We have consistently brought this to your attention in the hope of galvanizing meaningful and unified action. An urgent and coordinated response is needed now. Let us be clear. Anti-Semitism is not activism. It is hatred, pure and simple. It threatens Jewish communities and undermines the foundations of democracy and human rights. We must also reject any attempt to suggest that the atrocities of October 7th require context. There is no context, none whatsoever, that excuses the massacre of civilians that has been done to women and children or the execution of youth at a music festival. These were acts of terror. Framing them otherwise betrays this Council's moral responsibility and purpose. The safety and dignity of Jewish communities is not negotiable. They must be defended through the uncompromising prosecution of hate crimes, the credible rejection of all forms of anti-Semitism, and a firm stance against those who glorify anti-Jewish violence. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. International Dalit Solidarity Network is next.
Thank you, Chair. The International Dalit Solidarity Networks thanks the Special Rapporteur for her report and for highlighting the tripartite marginalization of caste, gender and poverty in South Asia. Intersectional discrimination, especially where caste and gender overlaps, remains widespread. Factors like economic status, disability, religion, and sexual orientation further deepen exclusion, limiting access to rights and opportunities. An intersectional approach is essential to address systemic caste-based discrimination. However, we are concerned that both the UN and the caste-affected states are not giving this issue the attention it demands. We urge member states to consult diverse Dalit women in empowerment efforts, collect disaggregated data by caste, gender, religion, and disability and sexual orientation. Strengthen justice system to prevent and respond to caste and gender-based discrimination and violence. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. Partners for Transparency is next.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Partners for Transparency thanks the Special Rapporteur for her report and work and expresses its deep concern about the alarming rise of racist and neo-Nazi movements, which pose a direct threat to peace and social cohesion in many countries, particularly Western ones. Recent trends indicate that the internet and social media platforms are becoming central tools for spreading racist propaganda and hate speech. Facebook announced that it removes approximately 66,000 hateful posts per week. Furthermore, recent years have witnessed the increasing penetration of racist ideas into official political discourse, with political leaders in Sweden and the US calling for exclusionary policies against refugees and migrants, practices that fuel institutional discrimination. Neo-Nazi groups have also become more organized and bolder, particularly in the US, where the public marches have been held, featuring Nazi symbols and racist slogans, a clear indication of the rise of this extremist movement. In conclusion, Madam Vice President, Partners Foundation calls upon the Western states to take firm measures to prohibit glorification of Nazism and criminalize racist propaganda online. Our question to the Special Rapporteur is, what mechanisms does she propose to combat the spread of neo-Nazism in the digital space, especially among young people? Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. And I give the floor to Oweit Pama.
Madam Vice President, the Special Rapporteur's report on contemporary racism and discrimination highlights the urgent need to combat all forms of intolerance. Racism and related intolerance fuel conflicts worldwide with devastating humanitarian impacts. In Sudan, violence driven by extremist groups, including the Muslim Brotherhood, has displaced over 13 million people and caused widespread famine. On May 22nd, the U.S. State Department reported Sudan's use of chemical weapons, violating the Chemical Weapons Convention. OIPMA calls on Sudan to seize all chemical weapons and use comply with international obligations. We urge this Council to support accountability through OPCW investigations and the ICC, while advancing peace initiatives to end Sudan's suffering. Aligned with the UN's mission to protect future generations from war, OIPMA proposes an international decade of tolerance from 2025 to 2035. This initiative seeks to eradicate intolerance, hatred, and extremism, foster peace, and promote empathy, education, inclusion, and intercultural dialogue, especially in LDCs. Tolerance must become a daily practice across policies, education, and communities. Only sustained collective action can build a future of peace, dignity, and respect. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. Consejo Indigenista Misionario, you have the floor. CIMI.
Señora Relatora.
Madam Rapporteur, your report about the visit to Brazil exposes the ongoing existence of racism against indigenous people, and which is worse, it's gone on for a long time, have an impact on all the indigenous people there. After their historic victory in the Supreme Court in 2023, have seen how their rights have been violated by Congress through Law 14701. There's now a conciliation tribunal created by the Supreme Court, and also that has frustrated the rights. The companies are putting pressure to carry out mining. The state has a duty to map out indigenous land, and the rapporteur is right in saying so. During her your visit to visit, you condemned acts of violence against the Guarani Kaiyoba people as a manifestation of structural racism. After your visit, there were new attacks against these peoples in other indigenous territories in Brazil with the participation of individual and state actors. These atrocities have received the support of economic and political sectors that are local, and this is because there is a lack of mapping out of traditional territories, and constitutional rights are not respected. Brazil will be hosting COP30, but the environmental racism of Brazil has left an indelible mark. We urge the government to fully and in good faith implement the recommendations stemming from your report. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. Instituto Brasileiro de Direitos Humanos, you have the floor.
Madam, thank you for your report on Brazil's visit. The Brazilian government recognized that racism is systemic and has established important programs and enacted legislation to prevent and address racial discrimination. However, the justice system remains selective, and the public security follows a rather punitive approach, perpetuating systemic racism. This issue, along with the country's unhealed history of slavery, has turned poor neighborhoods into places of constant surveillance and control. In these areas, racially sectors face many barriers to social mobility and are often exposed to police brutality. Because of the stringent inequality, prison are used as the near-fast replacement for public policies in communities that not receive basic social services. For many, the state is only present through police and prisons. Brazil overspends incarceration while investment in essential services such as education, health, and housing are reduced. It's urgent that Brazil creates public service and justice policies that work together, consider different forms of intersection discrimination and focus on alternatives to prison. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. And I give the floor to MRG Minority Rights Group.
Thank you, Chair. Madam Special Report. We welcome to report and recommend you for recognizing intersectional and systemic nature of the racism in Brazil. As Instituto Vidas Negras com Deficiência Importam and a Minority Rights Group, we echo the urgency of addressing the visibility and the dual discrimination faced by Black people with disability in Brazil. We are deeply concerned that systemic racism and ableism continues to produce and perpetuate disability through state violence, medical negligence, environmental injustice, and structural exclusion. We urge the Council to call on the Brazilian government to recognize the production of the disability through racialized state violence, including policy brutality and obstructive violence. Collect disaggregated and quantitative data of the Black people with disabilities. Ensure reproductive justice and prevent forced sterilization of African descendants people with disabilities. Guarantee accessible and inclusive education to the Black children with disabilities. Strengthen policies that promote independent living and end institutionalization practices. Without the urgent, targeted action, Black people with disability in Brazil will remain and at the margins and anti-racist and disability agendas. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. Shams, you have the floor.
Madam Special Rapporteur, Shams expresses its deep concern over Israel's persistent and systematic racial discrimination and apartheid policies against the Palestinian people in clear violation of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, including the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. For decades, Palestinians have been subjected to a system of apartheid, segregation, and racial discrimination manifested in discriminatory laws, policies, and practices that permeate every aspect of daily life. This includes the illegal construction and expansion of settlements, the forced displacement of Palestinian communities, restrictions on movement, arbitrary arrests, home demolitions, and the denial of basic rights solely based on national and ethnic identity. The dual legal system enforced in the occupied Palestinian territory, whereby Israeli settlers enjoy full rights under Israeli civil law, while Palestinians are subjected to harsh military rule, is a stark embodiment of racial discrimination. We urge your mandate to address the entrenched system of racial discrimination imposed on Palestinians and call on the international community to uphold its legal obligations. Immediate protection, equal rights, and accountability for Israel's apartheid and discriminatory policies are urgently needed. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor to CSI, Christian Solidarity International.
Madam Vice President, it has been nearly 22 months since Azerbaijan expelled 120,000 ethnic Armenians from their homeland in Nagorno-Karabakh during September 2023. It has been 20 months since the International Court of Justice ordered the Republic of Azerbaijan, in accordance with its obligations under the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, to ensure that persons who have left Nagorno-Karabakh after 19 September 2023 and who wish to return to Nagorno-Karabakh are able to do so in a safe, unimpeded, and expeditious manner. The court also ordered Azerbaijan to protect and preserve registration, identity, and private property documents and records of the Armenians who fled Nagorno-Karabakh. Not only has the government of Azerbaijan failed to uphold this order, it is actively destroying Armenian-owned homes, property, and entire villages, making it impossible in many cases for this order to be carried out. Given this flagrant disregard for international law and the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, Christian Solidarity International once again urges the Human Rights Council to appoint a special rapporteur for Nagorno-Karabakh and to take all necessary steps to ensure that the ethnic Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh can return home. Madam Special Rapporteur, what further mechanisms can be applied to ensure the right of return of ethnic Armenians to Nagorno-Karabakh is upheld? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. I now give the floor to CISA, Indian Council of South America.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chair. General Assembly Resolution 644 and 1328 in the decolonization process called for the elimination of all racial discrimination law and policy. The intersectionality that the Special Rapporteur brings up must be addressed internationally for indigenous peoples who are recognized under the United Nations Charter or with international treaties. Indigenous peoples have been characterized as peoples over whom the superior genius of the European civilization expresses its authority over us in this racist ideology from the Supreme Court of the United States. Of course, when you look at more intersectionality in history, the Nazi movement was inspired by the racist ideology of the KKK as members of the Ku Klux Klan raced in the 1920s and marched in Washington, D.C. It was also inspired by the Union of South Africa Citizens, who drew apartheid as one of their main acts. It is very important that the manner of administrative discrimination by Western states that affects the OHCHR and manipulate the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights is addressed so that the structural, managerial, and administrative discrimination exercised within
The Deputy President interrupts.
Este fue el
Thank you. This was the last speaker we could accommodate. I'm now going to give the floor to the Rapporteur Ashwini for her closing statements. You have 6 minutes, Madam.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Firstly, I would like to thank all the member states, civil society organizations for their constructive and thoughtful observations and questions. I welcome and extend my appreciation to all the member states who have adopted and who plan to initiate an intersectional approach in their legislative measures and policy making. Across both my reports, a clear pattern emerges. Structural inequality, when left unaddressed, creates fertile ground for rising hate, systemic violence, and the deepening exclusion of racially and ethnically marginalized groups. And the findings are troubling and demand urgent and coordinated response. From my report on neo-Nazism, I underscore that racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia are not isolated or episodic. They're complex, multifaceted, and increasingly normalized, and stakeholder submissions reveal a marked rise in racially motivated hate crimes, anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim incidents in the recent past, and the mainstreaming of far-right-wing ideologies into public discourse and politics. And this is further exacerbated by declining content moderation on social media platforms and algorithm amplification of harmful content, often targeting young people for extremist recruitment. In this light, I urge member states to reaffirm their international legal obligation and adopt coordinated national responses. And it's highly important for member states to implement comprehensive measures to address hate speech and incitement to racial and religious hatred. And this must be done while protecting the right to freedom of expression, guided by the Rabat Plan of Action and General Recommendation number 35 of the Committee of the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Most importantly, specific actions is required to regulate online platforms. States must mandate effective content moderation, hold companies accountable for providing a platform for propagating hate, and combat the algorithm spread of racist and neo-Nazi ideologies. Member states must take serious note of corporate accountability pertaining to hate speech disseminated on social media platforms. I also call for criminalization of acts that glorify Nazism and incite racial hatred, alongside the adoption of national action plans to combat racism and far-right extremism. Finally, disaggregated data is essential, and states must systematically collect and publish data on hate crimes and hate speech, including incidents that promote neo-Nazi ideologies, and the data is to be disaggregated by race, ethnicity, religion, gender, caste, and other relevant markers. With regards to the comments and questions on best practices to adopt intersectional approach in reparatory justice and to improve international standards, and tangible actions to be taken for the adoption of intersectional approach, I would like to reiterate that there is a dire need to change the pedagogy and discourse of legislative reforms to develop intersectional approach in policy making. And my report emphasizes that understanding and addressing racism and racial discrimination and other forms of similar discrimination today requires an intersectional approach. And I must say that intersectional approach is not a theoretical preference, it is a legal and empirical necessity. And intersectionality has to be grounded in the lived experiences of affected persons, must be integrated in all aspects of policy, law, and institutional reforms, and member states must ensure that those impacted by systemic racism, such as women of African descent, Dalit, indigenous women, Roma, Muslim, and Arab women, Palestinian women, persons with disabilities, LGBTQI individuals, stateless persons are not merely consulted but meaningfully included in shaping solutions. Most importantly, intersectionality must be legally recognized and reflected in comprehensive anti-discrimination frameworks. Legal definition should reflect lived experiences, and it is essential to adopt special measures like that of affirmative action in education, employment, and political representation, including targeted resources for social inclusive policies and community programs. And these community programs must be designed and evaluated using intersectional lens, and the voices of those affected should shape the rational design and outcome of such measures. Apart from this, the data system must be restructured. I urge member states to collect and report disaggregated data across multiple axes: race, caste, gender, disability, religion, migration status, and combine qualitative findings with quantitative accounts to ensure policy is grounded in real-world experiences. And states should adopt and implement reparatory justice mechanisms that address the structural and historical roots of racial and intersectional discrimination, including colonialism, slavery, caste oppression, and patriarchy. And in addition, reparations must be comprehensive, embedded in institutional framework. I would like to conclude by stating that it is now incumbent upon us to move from acknowledgement to action through law, education, policy, data, and accountability. And the credibility of our international human rights system rests on our commitment to confront the most entrenched, interconnected, systemic forms of inequality. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. This brings us to the end of the interactive dialogue. We'd like to thank Ms. Ashwini for her involvement and the presentation of her report. Thank you very much indeed, Madam.
Excelencias.
Excellencies, my understanding is that some delegations have requested to avail themselves of their right of reply in connection with statements under Agenda Item 9. May I remind delegations that pursuant to our current customary practice, the right to reply can only be exercised in response to statements made from the podium. Delegations cannot exercise the right to reply against a statement made by a presenter on the podium during the HRC. This includes the High Commissioner, mandate holders, or any other expert or representative of a subsidiary body of the Human Rights Council. I now give the floor in that connection to the distinguished representative of India. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Indian delegation is compelled to exercise its right of reply in response to yet another baseless and malicious statement by Pakistan, a habitual offender in misusing UN forums to peddle falsehoods and propaganda. Terrorism is the greatest enemy of humankind, and Pakistan's desperate attempts to invert reality by distorting facts are not only misleading, but also deeply ironic, given its well-documented role as the epicenter of cross-border terrorism. The Council needs no lecture from Pakistan, a country where minorities face systemic discrimination and persecution, often with the direct involvement by the state. On 22nd April 2025, 26 innocent Indian tourists were brutally massacred in Pahalgam, Jammu and Kashmir, victims of a barbaric terrorist attack orchestrated by Pakistani terrorists. This heinous act, rightly condemned by the UN Security Council, lays bare the true face of Pakistan's state-sponsored terror apparatus. The Pakistan's attempts to mischaracterize India's targeted and proportionate counter-terror operations are not only false, they are unacceptable. A nation that glorifies UN-designated terrorists with public honors and state funerals forfeits any credibility when it comes to preaching peace or human rights. Pakistan's record is not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of international infamy. Madam Vice President, the only crisis in Jammu and Kashmir stems from Pakistan's continued export of cross-border terrorism and its attempts to ruin the local economy, a direct consequence of its continued sponsorship of terrorism as state policy. Let us be clear, no amount of pretense or repetition can lend credibility to Pakistan's fabricated narrative. The international community is not blind to its pattern of distortion and denial. We urge Pakistan to look inward, address the rot of terrorism within its borders, and cease its obsessive and futile attempts to vilify India on the world stage. It would do well to focus on its internal human rights and treatment of minorities rather than wasting this esteemed Council's time. I thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. May I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan, who also has 3 minutes.
Vice President, what is the definition of a rogue state? A rogue state holds the international law in utter contempt and violates its every precept unabashedly. A state that illegally occupies a UN-recognized disputed territory, disregards UNSC resolutions, and shamelessly attempts to perpetuate its illegal occupation. A state that violates every human right of those under its illegal occupation. A state that demolishes innocent people's homes and perpetrates collective punishment. A state that carries out demographic engineering projects in occupied territory at an industrial scale. A state that blatantly contravenes the UN Charter and violates the sovereignty of other states. A state that constructs its political edifice on racial, communal, and ethnic hatred and polarization. A state that attacks innocent civilians and violates the international humanitarian law and takes pride in these violations. And a rogue state does everything to evade accountability for its crimes. Madam Vice President, this rogue state is not in the Middle East. It is in South Asia. And sadly, it is our neighbor. India, as a rogue state, gives tough competition to others in quest to surpass them. After launching unprovoked and unjustified cross-border attacks on civilians in Pakistan, it attempted to cut off water and gloated about threatening the well-being of 240 million civilians. This rogue state, due to its reckless behavior, brought the entire region to the precipice of a nuclear war. Madam Vice President, this rogue state supports, fuels, funds, and above all, its political leadership takes credit for peddling state-sponsored terrorism in Pakistan. This rogue state not only stifles any dissent within its territory, but assassinates dissidents extraterritorially in other sovereign states. Madam Vice President, while the list of crimes committed by this rogue state can go on, the pain and suffering inflicted by its terror sponsorship is deeply personal for many, including myself. Mr. Hidayatullah Jamod, a serving government officer, was not only a classmate, but a personal friend who lost his life in Balochistan last month at the hands of terrorists armed and supported by India. He symbolized hope and courage that countless Baloch youth associated with. His only crime was that instead of falling prey to the propaganda of these Fitna al-Hindustan terrorists, he invested his life in the future of Pakistan and endeavored to serve his motherland. Madam Vice President, I reiterate that Pakistan will respond to any challenge posed by the Indian military or by its lackeys in the form of terrorists or any other manifestation of these threats, by all means at our disposal. I thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. May I ask if any other delegation wishes to avail themselves of their right of reply in connection with statements made under agenda item 9? I see no request. Thank you very much indeed, therefore. So, agenda item 9 is over. We are going to take a very short break before we begin our interactive dialogue on the oral update of the High Commissioner on Ukraine and the interim report of the Secretary-General on Crimea. Thank you very much.
Excelencias, distinguidos colegas.
Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, I call to order agenda item 10, technical assistance and capacity building. Agenda item 10. We shall now start with our interactive dialogue on the oral update of the High Commissioner on the conclusions contained in the periodic report of the OHCHR on the human rights situation in Ukraine, pursuant to the provisions of Resolution 53/30 of the Human Rights Council, and on the interim report of the Secretary-General on the human rights situation in Ukraine's temporary occupied territories, including the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the town of Sebastopol, pursuant to the content of Resolution 79/184 of the General Assembly. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. It's an honor for me now to extend a warm welcome to and give the floor to Ms. Ilse Brands-Keris, Deputy Secretary-General of the United Nations for Human Rights. Assistant Secretary-General, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. Since the office briefed this Council last March, ceasefire talks have stalled and the fighting has escalated with a serious increase in civilian casualties. Along the front line, Russian armed forces have continued their push to acquire control of further territory. Attacks with short-range drones have killed and injured hundreds of civilians, particularly older people. In April, May and June, nearly 50% more civilians were killed or injured than in the same period in 2024. More than 90% of these casualties were in territory controlled by Ukraine. The trend over the past 2 years is that civilian deaths and injuries have peaked in the summer months. In April, the office documented that some of the missiles that struck cities were equipped with warheads that exploded in the air, scattering fragments across large areas. In some cases, several drones struck the same hospital. In the night of 16th to 17th of June alone, an hours-long attack killed more civilians in Kiev than any other attack in nearly a year. These attacks are instilling terror and anxiety in cities across Ukraine. We call again on the Russian Federation to cease the use of force against Ukraine immediately, in line with United Nations General Assembly resolutions, the United Nations Charter and other applicable international law, including the binding order on provisional measures of the International Court of Justice. Madam Vice President, there is some positive news. The ceasefire negotiations have facilitated the return of hundreds of prisoners of war, the bodies of deceased soldiers and some civilian detainees. Families who lived in uncertainty and anxiety for many months or even years finally have some answers about the fate of their loved ones. Soldiers have reunited with their families. The exchanges have allowed many to escape torture, ill treatment, and otherwise inhuman conditions of captivity. From these last rounds of exchanges, our office interviewed more than 117 Ukrainian former prisoners of war. They provided detailed, consistent accounts of torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, including sexual violence in Russian captivity, often corroborated by their injuries and the accounts of other former prisoners. These accounts confirm that torture and ill treatment of Ukrainian prisoners of war continue in numerous detention facilities, patterns that we have repeatedly documented and reported. I reiterate the High Commissioner's call on the Russian authorities to ensure that prisoners of war are treated in accordance with international humanitarian and human rights law. The law is equally binding on the Ukrainian authorities. We continue to interview Russian prisoners in Ukrainian captivity. And although the scale is not comparable, we have documented cases where Ukrainian authorities have used torture and ill treatment in the early stages of captivity in unofficial places of detention. Ukrainian authorities have launched investigations into several of these allegations. Our office calls on them to ensure that these investigations are carried out in line with international standards. Madam Vice President, In addition to presenting our office periodic report on the human rights situation in Ukraine, I also present the United Nations Secretary-General's interim report on the occupied territories. Despite repeated requests, the Russian Federation has regrettably not granted our office access to these territories. We have therefore continued our monitoring based on remote methodology. The Russian Federation continues to violate its obligations as an occupying power under international humanitarian law, notably by imposing its legal and governance system in the occupied territory, compelling inhabitants to swear allegiance to it, and transferring protected persons within occupied territory and deporting protected people to the Russian Federation. In the last 6 months, we have also documented an increase in efforts by the Russian Federation to unlawfully expropriate the private property of people who have been displaced, which is also a violation of international humanitarian law. My office is concerned that the Russian authorities have set in train processes that will facilitate expropriations on a large scale in Mariupol. The Russian authorities continue to impose severe restrictions on civic space in the occupied territory, in particular on exercise of freedom of expression. Legitimate criticism of the occupying authorities, disagreement with policies, or even simple expression of sympathy with victims of the war are often met with administrative court proceedings and fines, and in worst-case scenarios, harsh prison sentences. This is irreconcilable with international human rights law. Madam Vice President, at the last session of the Human Rights Council, the High Commissioner called for an end to attacks on civilians and the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. He called for torture and mistreatment of prisoners of war to end, and for the Russian Federation to respect the human rights of people in areas under its occupation. And he emphasized that peace is more imperative than ever. Those calls are even more urgent today. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. Pursuant to our practice, we will first hear from the delegations of the countries affected by the reports. I see that the representative of the Russian Federation is not in the room. I now, therefore, give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine, Ambassador. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank the Assistant Secretary-General for her update and commend the work of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. Its evidence-based reporting, produced under the most challenging conditions, is not only a record of truth, but a foundation for future justice. We are deeply grateful for this commitment to exposing the realities of Russia's war against Ukraine. The mission's office is situated in Podil district in Kiev, in the heart of our capital. Just like all residents of Kiev, its staff is subjected to daily attacks by drones and ballistic missiles launched by Russian armed forces targeting civilian objects, while with the aim of killing, injuring and terrorizing as many Ukrainians as possible, to wipe the ancient capital of Ukraine off the face of the earth. The latest figures contained in the report are alarming. The overwhelming majority of civilian casualties occurred as a result of Russia's intensified, relentless aerial attacks. While its missiles strike hospitals and playgrounds, Russia continues to falsely claim it targets military infrastructure. This is not warfare, it is terrorism celebrated with impunity. Madam Assistant Secretary-General, we also take note of the information of the alleged violations from the Ukrainian side and will examine them with full seriousness in line with our international obligations. Even under siege, Ukraine upholds its commitments under international humanitarian and human rights law, and we reiterate our demand for the Russian Federation to do the same. As occupying power, it bears full responsibility for the human rights situation in the territories under its temporary military control. We strongly condemn Russia's continued denial of unimpeded access to the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and other temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, despite persistent requests from OHCHR. This deliberate obstruction seeks to conceal the grave human rights violations committed in those territories. It is not only a violation of international law, but a direct affront to the values of United Nations. We are witnessing the systematic erasure of Ukrainian identity. As it is noted in the Secretary-General's interim report, Russia has imposed its political, legal and administrative systems in occupied regions, following the same destructive pattern it has used in Crimea since 2015. The March 2025 decree redefining the legal status of Ukrainian citizens, the recent ban on Ukrainian language instruction in schools, and the illegal expropriation of property belonging to displaced Ukrainians all point to a policy of demographic engineering. These acts risk irreparable harm to future generations and jeopardize prospects for a comprehensive, just and lasting peace. Torture, summary executions, arbitrary detention, sexual violence and enforced disappearances remain defining features of Russia's war. One of the most harrowing recent cases is that of Ukrainian journalist Victoria Roshchina, whose body was returned to Ukraine in February 25, months after her death in Russian captivity, showing signs of torture and mutilation. Victoria had traveled to Zaporizhia to report on the torture of civilians. Instead, she was detained, transferred across the border and perished in the very system she sought to expose. Distinguished delegates, we must not allow Russia's crimes to be normalized or forgotten. The forcible deportation of children, attacks on civilian infrastructure, torture of prisoners of war, and cultural erasure are not isolated incidents. They are part of a coordinated strategy to destroy the very fabric of the Ukrainian nation. In this regard, we are happy to inform that on June 25 in Strasbourg, President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky and Secretary-General of the Council of Europe Alain Berset signed the agreement between Ukraine and the Council of Europe on the establishment of the Special Tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. The Special Tribunal is the first international judicial body since World War II with jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute individuals regardless of their position, suspected of committing the crime of aggression. The establishment of the tribunal marks the culmination of years of legal work of Ukraine, its partners, Council of Europe, European Union, to ensure justice for the victims of Russian aggression. Justice must be sought for every life destroyed, every child taken, every community left in ruins. Together, we have the moral duty to ensure that these grave crimes do not go unpunished, and that those responsible are truly held to account. I thank you.
Muchas gracias,
Thank you very much, Ambassador. May I now call upon interested delegations to put questions and make comments on what you have just heard. First, on behalf of a group of countries, may I give the floor to Her Excellency Elina Valtonen, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Finland. You have the floor, Madam.
President, I will speak on behalf of the Nordic Baltic states. We thank the High Commissioner for this update. Russia continues its ruthless attacks against civilians, demonstrating its unwillingness to seek peace. We condemn the devastating airstrikes across Ukraine, which may amount to crimes against humanity. We remain deeply alarmed about the unlawful deportation and transfer of Ukrainian children. We urge Russia to ensure their safe and immediate return. We commend the progress in the exchange of prisoners of war, yet we are gravely concerned about the reports of the systematic torture and execution of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians. Finally, we support all efforts towards a sustainable and lasting peace in Ukraine. Any solution must fully uphold Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union. Please go ahead.
President, Under Secretary General, we share your alarm over the increasing number of civilians killed and injured due to Russia's use of drones and explosive weapons with wide area effect in urban areas. Your report also indicates the widespread violations against Ukrainian soldiers captured by Russian armed forces continues. The EU condemns in the strongest possible terms the increasing number of summary executions of prisoners of war, as well as systemic and widespread use of torture against them. According to the reports of the Commission of Inquiry, the Russian authorities committed crimes against humanity. The European Union also continues to strongly condemn the use of torture and other forms of ill treatment, arbitrary detentions, unlawful deportations, and forcible transfers. Discrimination and other violations directed at civilians in the temporarily occupied regions of Ukraine. We express our grave concern at the militarization and indoctrination of Ukrainian minors and youth by Russia. All Ukrainian children and civilian detainees held by Russia must be returned to Ukraine immediately and safely. High Commissioner, can you elaborate on the finding in your report of increased recruitment and use of Ukrainian children by Russia in the context of its war of aggression? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. The list of speakers is now closed. May I now give the floor to the Netherlands, speaking on behalf of a group of country or states.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President, and I'm pleased to deliver the statement on behalf of the group of friends. Throughout Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, OHCHR monitoring mission has continued to document a wide array of violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law committed by Russian authorities. We just now heard some harrowing examples. With this latest report, we are again confronted with independently gathered and verified evidence of Russia's disregard for civilian safety. The HRMMU has assessed inter alia that the targeting by drone operators has, in practice, violated the rules of international humanitarian law governing the conduct of hostilities, in particular the principles of distinction and precaution. Furthermore, the HRMMU has found that some incidents may amount to the war crime of intentionally directing attacks against civilians. And these attacks not only caused death and injury, they exacerbated an already critical humanitarian situation by limiting civilian access to essential services, to humanitarian aid and medical care, affecting a wide range of human rights. Madam ASG, these violations, as well as other violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, need to be further investigated. Those responsible need to be held to account. Therefore, we reiterate our unwavering commitment to supporting efforts aimed at bringing perpetrators to justice and preventing further crimes. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador. I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Montenegro.
We thank the Secretary-General for the update. We are deeply alarmed by the Russian Federation's intensifying massive ballistic, missile and drone attacks on numerous urban areas across Ukraine, resulting in the appalling 37% increase in human casualties during the reporting period. These barbaric attacks have killed and injured nearly 6,000 civilians, including women and children, mostly from major cities across Ukraine, including Kiev. The death toll and deliberate shelling of civilians and civilian infrastructure are a clear demonstration of Russia's contempt for international law, a blatant disregard for human life, and the lack of sincere intent regarding a ceasefire and peace negotiation leading to comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter and international law. While we welcome the recent exchange of POVs, we point to the report's references to many Ukrainian civilians and POVs in Russian captivity who continue to be subjected to widespread and systematic acts of torture and ill treatment, including sexual violence, and suffering human conditions in violation of international law. We again appeal for the full exchange of POVs and for the immediate release and safe return of all Ukrainian children and other civilians unlawfully deported, forcibly transferred, or arbitrarily detained by Russia. Madam SG, as repeatedly stated, there can be no lasting peace without justice, nor impunity for crimes committed in connection with Russia's war of aggression. The recent progress in establishing a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine within the framework of the Council of Europe is a significant step in this regard. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Slovakia.
Gracias, Senora Vicepresidenta. Slovakia aligns itself with the EU statement. Madam Assistant Secretary-General, thank you for the presentation of the report and the valuable work of the OHCHR in Ukraine. We hear reports about the human rights situation in Ukraine on every Human Rights Council session, but the devastating impact of the Russian aggression doesn't seem to diminish. Despite all the efforts, including direct talks between Russia and Ukraine, the situation shows no sign of de-escalation. Ukrainian critical and civilian infrastructure is even more intensively targeted, and sadly, the number of civilian casualties grows daily. Equally, the level of human rights violations continues and increases. It is unacceptable that accounts of torture, sexual violence, ill treatment of prisoners of war and civilians are present in every report. Justice and accountability are an integral part of any post-conflict and comprehensive peace solution. It is important to hold all the perpetrators accountable. That's also why it is so important to have eyes and ears on the spot. Therefore, we call on Russia to provide the OHCHR an independent international monitoring mechanism with safe and unhindered access to the occupied territory of Ukraine. Madam ASG, let me stress once again that Slovakia is firmly committed and will support further efforts aimed at achieving a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine. We reiterate our belief that the solution must be based on the UN Charter and must respect the independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the delegation of Cyprus.
Madam Vice President, Cyprus aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the Assistant Secretary-General for her report. Cyprus condemns Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and the illegal annexation of Ukrainian territory in violation of the UN Charter and international law. We are deeply alarmed by the steep increase in civilian casualties resulting from the intensification of Russia's military operations. We are appalled by the report's findings detailing Russia's ongoing use of torture and acts of sexual violence committed against Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war. According to credible reports, Ukrainian children have been recruited by Russian state actors and used in armed conflict in violation of the prohibition in international law on the recruitment and use of children in hostilities. We reiterate our call to Russia to immediately end the unlawful practice of deportation and forcible transfer of children and to ensure their prompt and safe return to Ukraine. Illegality resulting from invasion, occupation and the use of force can never be accepted or normalized. As a country that continues to endure the consequences of foreign invasion and occupation, Cyprus stands in full solidarity with Ukraine and reaffirms its unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I now give the floor to the Ambassador of France. You have the floor, Madam.
Merci. The massive and systematic use of torture, inhuman treatment, sexual violence against Ukrainian prisoners are continuing in a systematic manner, as you underscore. In violation of international humanitarian law, Russia continues to target civilians, as we've seen by the massive attacks targeting Kiev in the night of 17th and 18th of June, which caused more than 28 deaths. France firmly condemns these practices. France also condemns the illegal deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia, and we remain mobilized to encourage the return of Ukrainian children to their families. In the illegally occupied territories occupied by Russia, the populations are forced to accept Russian nationality to have access to healthcare or to work. The forced recruitment and transfer of protected persons must cease, and all restrictions on the fundamental rights should also cease. France reasserts its unwavering support for Ukraine and its people, which are resisting with remarkable courage the war of aggression waged by Russia. We call for the establishment as soon as possible of a ceasefire and the launch of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia for a solid, lasting settlement of the conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the Ambassador of Ireland.
Thank you, Vice President. Ireland aligns with the EU statement, and I want to thank the ASG for her update. Ireland reiterates its condemnation of Russia's unjustifiable war of aggression against Ukraine, and we condemn Russia's occupation of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, the human rights violations and abuses that have occurred in temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, and all human rights violations and abuses that have been carried out during the course of Russia's war. Ireland is also concerned at reports of the torture and ill treatment of prisoners of war. Ireland condemns the forcible transfer or deportation of Ukrainian citizens, including children from Ukraine to Russia by Russian authorities, and this constitutes a clear violation of international humanitarian law. We deplore efforts by Russia to alter the demographic composition of the occupied territories of Ukraine and are concerned by the removal of land ownership rights of Ukrainian citizens by Russian authorities in Crimea. We are alarmed that Russia is enforcing military conscription in the occupied territories and promoting a militarist culture among children in these territories. We are also appalled by the reports of the recruitment of Ukrainian children to commit acts of sabotage against Ukrainian military targets and civilians. Assistant Secretary-General, what steps can the international community take to ensure accountability for conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. May I now give the floor to the delegation of Germany.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Germany aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union, and we would like to join others in thanking you, Assistant Secretary-General, for your update. As you laid out, Ukrainians continue to be attacked, wounded and killed every day by Russia's military as part of Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. All of these human rights violations are meticulously documented by OHCHR's Human Rights Monitoring Mission on Ukraine. And in spite of all these violations, the people of Ukraine are resisting aggression and intimidation. We pay tribute to their courage. And we also call on Russia to comply finally with international law and engage in serious negotiations. But while atrocities continue, we must continue to document them and push for accountability. That's why we support the continuation of the High Commissioner's updates on Ukraine. In closing, one specific question, Madam Assistant Secretary-General. From your point of view, how should the needs and priorities of ethnic groups in Ukraine, such as the Crimean Tatars, be recognized and addressed in potential future discussions around a peace framework? Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Japan.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We would like to thank Assistant Secretary-General for her oral update on the dire human rights situation in Ukraine. We also appreciate the Secretary-General's interim report on the human rights situation in Crimea. More than 3 years have passed since Russia launched its aggression against Ukraine, which we reiterate is a clear violation of international law and shakes the very foundation of the international order. If such violations were tolerated, it would set a very dangerous precedent. We once again condemn in the strongest terms the actions of the Russian forces, which have led to a large number of civilian casualties. We support the monitoring and technical assistance by OHCHR and Ukraine's efforts to uphold human rights in cooperation with international mechanisms. We also express our respect for the Ukrainian people who have demonstrated immense bravery in standing up against Russia's aggression day after day. Japan will continue to stand firmly with Ukraine and the international community until a just and lasting peace is achieved in Ukraine. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador. And I give the floor to the delegation of Czechia.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Czechia aligns itself with the EU statement. We appreciate the ASG's update and reaffirm the importance of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. Documentation of human rights violations remains a crucial part of this technical mandate. Czechia strongly condemns Russia's intensified attacks against civilians in Ukraine, including the use of drones and explosive weapons in residential areas. Deliberate targeting of civilians, including children, constitutes a war crime. We are deeply alarmed by the widespread and systemic torture of Ukrainian prisoners of war by Russian armed forces, including through sexual violence, and the high number of reported summary executions. In the temporarily occupied territories, the rights of Ukrainian citizens are being gravely violated. We are particularly concerned by the forced transfers and conscription of children, which are in clear breach of international humanitarian law. We call on Russia to release prisoners of war and all arbitrarily detained civilians, including children. We highlight the cases of Halina Dovopola, Irina Danilovic, and Irina Horodtsova, whose courage deserves our recognition and support. Madam Assistant Secretary-General, How can the Member States best support accountability for attacks against civilians and other grave violations documented in your report? I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor to the Ambassador of the Republic of Moldova.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We thank the High Commissioner for the update on the situation on Ukraine. Moldova continues to strongly condemn the brutality of the Russian aggression. We are deeply alarmed by the high number of civilian casualties reported, which represents a 37% increase compared with the same period of last year. The continued use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas is unacceptable and must cease immediately. We condemn drone attacks against civilian targets. The Russian Federation attacks on healthcare facilities are unacceptable and constitute a clear violation of international humanitarian law. We continue to condemn summary executions, patterns of widespread and systemic torture, and ill treatment by Russia against civilian detainees and prisoners of war. These practices must stop as well. The reported allegation of the Russian Federation use of Ukrainian children to conduct surveillance and commit acts of sabotage endangers the physical and psychological well-being of children and would be in violation of the international law. Madam Assistant Secretary-General, we support all the efforts aimed at achieving a ceasefire and bringing sustainable, just peace to Ukraine, as well as welcome the exchanges of prisoners of war. At the same time, we reiterate our call for immediate withdrawal of Russian troops from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. Madam Assistant Secretary-General, what more can be done to ensure accountability and a lasting peace in Ukraine? I thank you.
Muchas gracias, Embajador.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Albania. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Albania thanks the High Commissioner for the presentation and welcomes the Secretary-General's report on occupied Crimea. Albania supports the work of the United Nations Human Rights and Monitoring Mission in Ukraine and calls for unfettered access to all occupied territories for international human rights monitoring mechanism. We remain concerned by the ongoing and systematic violation of international humanitarian law by the Russians in Ukraine and in temporarily occupied territories. We strongly condemn the deliberate and repeated attacks by the Russian armed force against civilian population, civilian infrastructure and healthcare facilities, with devastating consequences for the civil population. The widespread using of drones from Russian forces by targeting ambulances, humanitarian conveys and public transportation, and to scatter landmines in populated area may amount to war crimes and must be thoroughly investigated with perpetrators held accountable. In the temporarily occupied territories, we deplore the continued forced imposition of Russian citizenship, arbitrary detention, torture, sexual violence, and the deportation of Ukrainian children. Albania stands in full solidarity with the people of Ukraine and will continue to support all efforts to ensure justice, accountability, and lasting peace. I thank you.
Gracias, Embajador.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I give the floor to the delegation of Austria.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Austria aligns with the EU statement, and we thank OHCHR and the ASG for the update and reiterate our full support for the work of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. We remain gravely concerned about the humanitarian consequences amongst the Ukrainian civilian population. The findings of the report document a 37% increase in civilian casualties, with the vast majority of casualties being the result of military operations by Russian armed forces in Ukrainian territory, including through the use of explosive weapons in urban areas and the increased use of short-range combat drones. Nearly half of all civilian casualties were caused by missiles, loitering munitions, and airdrop bombs in densely populated areas. Austria is alarmed by the devastating impact of the war on Ukrainian children. In this regard, we hope for concrete follow-up to recent negotiations in Istanbul by Russian authorities to safely return deported children to Ukraine. Further, serious violations against prisoners of war remain a major concern. We are deeply alarmed about accounts of continued torture and ill treatment, including sexual violence, and dire detention conditions in facilities managed by the Russian Federation. We therefore call for full respect of international humanitarian and human rights law, accountability for all violations, and unhindered access for humanitarian actors and independent monitors. I thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. I now give the floor to the delegation of Romania.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Romania aligns itself with the statement delivered by the EU
Latest reports underline a marked increase in civilian casualties during the last year in Ukraine due to intensive Russian attacks using wide-area explosive and short-range drones in populated areas, with direct attacks on critical civilian infrastructure, including 5 hospitals, which violate international humanitarian law. Swift and impartial investigation into alleged human rights violations, summary executions of prisoners of war, torture and sexual violence are mandatory, and perpetrators need to be held accountable before independent tribunals. Romania will continue to support all independent monitoring mandates that seek to document and investigate human rights violations and to promote justice for victims. We salute the recent signing of the founding documents for the Council of Europe Special Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine, with the aim of establishing the criminal accountability in the case of those individuals who bear the greatest responsibility for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. We continue to express grave concern over the systematic process of forced Russification in the temporary occupied territories of Ukraine and the ideological coercion of children imposed through the so-called military patriotic Russian education. Distinguished speakers, how do you assess the long-term impact of denying the expression of Ukrainian culture and language in the temporary occupied territories, and what role can the international community play in supporting the preservation of Ukrainian identity under occupation? I thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. May I give the floor now to the Ambassador of Croatia.
Thank you, Vice President. Croatia aligns with the EU statement. Unfortunately, Russia continues conducting unlawful attacks with explosive weapons and drones in populated areas of Ukraine. Such attacks cause numerous casualties and a wide-scale destruction of civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, contributing to the unnecessary suffering. We remain deeply concerned about the scale of human rights violations, including the use of children to commit acts of sabotage and arson, and executions of Ukrainian military personnel captured by Russian armed forces. Despite numerous reports of Russia's grave violations of international law, its aggression persists. While Croatia welcomes the recent agreement on the exchange of prisoners of war, which has enabled the return of combatants to their homes, the Russian Federation has yet to show genuine commitment to peace. Croatia continues to call for a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with the principles of the UN Charter and international law, with respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Madam SG, in light of the last week's agreement between Ukraine and the Council of Europe on establishing a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine, what opportunities do you see for this tribunal to meaningfully contribute to delivering justice for victims? I thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Luxembourg. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Luxembourg aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union. We welcome the report of the Secretary-General and reiterate our unwavering support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, including Crimea and Sevastopol, which are temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation. The conclusions of the report are in line with the case law and jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights, and which document grave and systematic violations of human rights, arbitrary detentions, torture, forced transfers, in particular of Ukrainian children, repression of minorities, in particular the Crimean Tatars, the imposition of Russian law, attacks on fundamental freedoms, and persecutions motivated by language, ethnic origin, or political positions are unacceptable and run counter to international humanitarian and international human rights law. These elements fully justify following up on all reports and inter-ethnic dialogue as provided for by Resolution 53/30, we call upon technical assistance to be provided to Ukraine to support democratic institutions, transitional justice and complaint mechanisms, and the rigorous documentation of international crimes. Luxembourg supports fully international efforts to guarantee accountability, in particular through specialized mechanisms, and encourage cooperation between international jurisdictions, human rights institutions and civil society. In this context, how can we envisage cooperation with the Special Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine, recently established by the Council of Europe? How can we bolster global efforts for accountability to push forward with justice for victims? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I now give the floor to Bulgaria.
Vice President, Bulgaria aligns itself with the EU statement. We welcome the interim report of the Secretary-General and thank for the update of the ASG. Bulgaria reiterates its strong condemnation of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. We remain deeply concerned about the violation of international human rights and humanitarian law by the Russian Federation in the temporary occupied territories of Ukraine, such as disrespecting the laws in force in the country, forced deportation and especially that of children, ill-treatment in places of detention, confiscation of property, violation of the freedom of expression, media and religion. We call for effective investigations, therefore. We are deeply concerned by the systematic violations of the ethno-cultural rights of the Bulgarian national minority in the temporary occupied territories of Ukraine. Russian authorities have severely restricted and subsequently banned the teaching of the Bulgarian language. The activities of the Bulgarian Sunday schools and cultural centers have been suspended, while at the same time Russian curricula have been imposed in local schools. We are deeply worried about the human rights situation of children in the temporary occupied territories of Ukraine, including those placed in social centers and with Russian families. Bulgaria remains consistent in its unwavering support for Ukraine, for its sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, as well as for its European and Euro-Atlantic perspective. Madam Assistant Secretary-General, what, in your view, is the most effective way to ensure the full accountability for human rights and humanitarian law violations in the temporary occupied territories of Ukraine? I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor to the delegation of the Sovereign Order of Malta.
Madam Vice President, the Order of Malta thanks for the report. We continue to deplore the ongoing war in Ukraine, where millions of civilians are directly affected in their everyday life. Our humanitarian assistance will be tirelessly pursued both in material and in psychosocial support. As the family as such constitutes the essential structure of our societies, we gave special attention to the children, 33,000 of them since the beginning of war. A priority is combating war trauma in children. We would like to join our voice to those deploring that during hostilities, children have been separated from their parents without a possibility to return home. A reunion of these families should happen without delay. An important goal is also our support to comprehensive veteran reintegration and to the lonely elderly people. The Order of Malta repeats its appeal to the parties for the respect of international humanitarian law and human rights law, for an immediate ceasefire and a truly negotiating process between the parties going beyond the initial steps reached so far. An approach based on the respect for the dignity of each individual should and can inspire a process leading to a true and long-lasting peace. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Georgia thanks the Commissioner for the update and commends the Office for its continued reporting. The latest report presents alarming evidence of systematic human rights and humanitarian law violations by the Russian Federation in temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories. Particularly disturbing are violations that constitute war crimes and are manifested in deportations and forcible transfers of Ukrainian children, many of whom have been subjected to unlawful changes of identity and citizenship. The report also outlines Russian-generated systematic human rights violations in occupied Ukraine regions, including forced citizenship, property seizures, torture, ill-treatment, and discrimination on the ethnic ground, especially against Crimean Tatars. We reiterate our strong support for OHCHR and other monitoring mechanisms in documenting violations and promoting accountability, and emphasize the need of immediate, safe, and unfettered access to be given to the OHCHR and other international humanitarian organizations to Crimea and other Ukrainian regions temporarily occupied by Russia. In conclusion, Georgia reaffirms its unwavering support for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, including its territorial waters. Thank you.
Gracias,
Thank you, Ambassador. May I now give the floor to the delegation of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary-General, for your update on the human rights situation in Ukraine's temporarily occupied territories. In June 2024, the European Court of Human Rights found Russia to have committed multiple human rights violations since its illegal annexation of Crimea. In May this year, the Council of Europe urged Russia to restore Ukrainian law in Crimea and end the use of torture and ill treatment. There are very concerning reports of civilians being detained and taken across the border into Russia, where they have been convicted on spurious charges. This includes those who work in critical civilian infrastructure, such as the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and journalists. We note your assessment that targeted use of drones, including attacks that have killed civilians while delivering humanitarian aid, has violated IHL principles of distinction and precaution. Russia must comply with international law. Rapid and unimpeded passage for humanitarian relief for civilians is needed. Those responsible must be held to account for the appalling forcible transfer of Ukrainian children and the enlistment of these children into military patriotic training programmes, potentially then being sent to fight against their own country. Assistant Secretary-General, given Russia's attempt to erase children's heritage, what steps can be taken to prevent the long-term erasure of their cultural and national identity? Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. Now give the floor to the Ambassador of Poland. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President, Madam Assistant Secretary-General. Poland aligns itself with the EU statement. We fully support the work of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. We are alarmed at the growing number of civilian casualties, including through an increased use of short-range drones. Drones have been used to deliberately attack Ukrainian civilians engaged in everyday activities. Those individuals, clearly unarmed, trusted would not be targeted, and yet they were. We condemn in the strongest terms Russia's use of Ukrainian children to commit acts of sabotage. This is unacceptable under any circumstances. Children must never be used as tools of war. Russia demonstrates a blatant disregard for human rights and humanitarian law. Its repeated rejections of numerous calls for ceasefire and targeting of civilians make it clear Russia would rather wage war than pursue peace. Poland remains steadfast in its commitment to accountability. Those responsible for international crimes perpetrated in and against Ukraine must be brought to justice. We welcome the recent progress made on establishing the Special Tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine within the framework of the Council of Europe. This is an important step towards preventing impunity and rebuilding confidence in the international rules-based order. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I now give the floor to the delegation of New Zealand.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. New Zealand thanks the Assistant Secretary-General for her update today and the Secretary-General for his report. Ongoing reporting on the human rights situation in Ukraine, including in the temporary occupied territories, is essential to ensure accountability for human rights violations. The update today and the Secretary-General's report detail that the human rights situation in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine continues to deteriorate, and that this is largely due to the Russian Federation's disregard for its responsibilities under international humanitarian law as an occupying power. New Zealand remains gravely concerned by the documented cases of executions, deaths in custody, arbitrary detention, torture, including sexual violence, ill treatment and enforced disappearance in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. New Zealand calls for the Russian Federation to fully uphold its obligations under international law, including international human rights law. Let us not forget that Russia's presence in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine is the result of multiple violations of Ukraine's territorial integrity since 2014, which have been consistently condemned by the UN membership. Assistant Secretary-General, as others have asked, what more can be done to ensure accountability for the human rights violations in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine? Thank you.
Muchas gracias, embajador.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I now would like to give the floor to the Ambassador of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The Republic of Korea appreciates the Assistant Secretary General's oral presentation. We take note of the recent, albeit limited, exchange of prisoners of war following the peace talks in Istanbul, which may serve as a step forward toward rebuilding trust. However, such progress remains fragile as Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine persists. Reports of continued attack on civilians and civilian infrastructure, including through the use of explosive weapons, point to tens of thousands of casualties and grave impacts on public health, education, and basic services. We are particularly alarmed by reports of unlawful killings, torture, enforced disappearances, and the forcible deportation of the Ukrainian children. We also share the concerns raised in the Secretary General's report regarding the lack of access for international human rights monitoring mechanisms. Against this backdrop, we underline the urgent need for compliance with international law, accountability for violations, and unrestricted monitoring access. The Republic of Korea will continue to work with the international community to help secure a lasting peace in Ukraine. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. I now give the floor to the delegation of Turkey.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We take note of the Assistant Secretary General's presentation. From the very first day of the Russia-Ukraine war, Turkey has maintained a principled and humanitarian approach grounded on international law in pursuit of peace and stability in the region and beyond. We sought to bring the sides around the negotiating table and supported all other genuine initiatives aimed at this. We prevailed in this persistent quest first in 2022 and then in this year. We consider the recent rounds of negotiations as the most significant breakthrough in the 4-year-long war. These talks provided a window of opportunity for ending the prolonged conflict, which has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives once and for all. It has yielded concrete results such as deals on prisoner exchanges and repatriation of fallen soldiers. It is important that the international community continues to encourage both sides to remain committed to the continuation of negotiations. A just and lasting peace is also an outcome that the Crimean Tatar people have been yearning for many years. Crimean Tatars have the right to live in their ancestral land freely, securely, and peacefully. Instead, they are subjected to consistent intimidation, mistreatment, and persecution. We will continue our efforts to ensure the safety and well-being of Crimean Tatars, especially for those who live in the occupied Crimea. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. I now recognize the delegation of Belarus.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The latest reports from the Secretary General and the oral information from the High Commissioner once again are noteworthy by the lack of balance, their bias and one-sided accusations against the Russian Federation. Once again, we see an instrument of pressure intentionally discrediting one sovereign state. And once again, we'd recall that accusations of this kind do not bring peace closer. And we're seeing that the multitude of violations by the Ukrainian authorities, the rampant Russophobia and hate speech can all be seen as persistent in Ukraine. We're seeing the repression on political grounds, as seen by the situation of the Kononovich brothers, and we call for their immediate release. Many of the problems, as before, are outside the agendas of human rights structures, and a principled, objective and unbiased evaluation of them has not yet been produced. And we call upon that to happen. Belarus once again supports initiatives to lessen tension in the region. We will provide comprehensive support for all humanitarian contacts between sides. We call upon other countries and international organizations to work in the interest of de-escalation and a rapid settlement and peace. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the delegation of Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We thank the High Commissioner for his oral update on the situation in Ukraine and the presentation of the Assistant Secretary-General's report on the human rights in Crimea. Liechtenstein remains deeply concerned about the serious violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law committed by the Russian Federation in the context of its unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine. We strongly condemn the continuing and brutal assault on Ukrainian civilians and its civilian infrastructure, the lack of credible commitment by the Russian Federation to a settlement of the conflict and the continued brutal attacks undermine a just and lasting peace. Ukrainian citizens in temporarily occupied territories may not be forced to acquire Russian citizenship, nor should they be pressured into military service to take up arms against their own country. We decry Russia's practice of indoctrinating Ukrainian children through so-called patriotic military education and urge the Federation to reinstate the Ukrainian state curriculum. It is egregious that Ukrainian children are not only being forcefully transferred into the Russian Federation, but also being instrumentalized for a war that threatens to destroy their future. We reiterate that the perpetrators of these violations of international law must be held to account and justice must be served. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. I now give the floor to the delegation of Switzerland.
Madam Vice President, Switzerland wishes to thank the Assistant Secretary-General for the updated information on the human rights situation in Ukraine and in the temporarily occupied territories. The report of the Secretary-General underscores the grave and persistent violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law by the occupying authorities from Russia, including arbitrary detentions, torture, sexual violence, forced displacement of civilians, including children, the forced granting of Russian nationality, discriminatory restrictions to access to vital services for non-Russian nationals, and violations of fundamental freedoms. We firmly denounce these violations by the authorities and the Russian armed forces. The report from OHCHR underscores an increase which is alarming in attacks against civilians and civilian property, in particular on essential infrastructure, which are seeing an alarming increase throughout the whole of Ukraine. Switzerland condemns these. They are a manifest violation of international humanitarian law, in particular the principle of distinction. These attacks must immediately cease, and those responsible must be brought to justice. We call upon all parties to fully respect their international obligations. Madam Assistant Secretary-General, how can your office contribute to bolstering dialogue with the Russian authorities to ensure the respect of international law? Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. Ambassador of Canada, you have the floor.
Merci, Madame Vice-Présidente. Le Canada.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Canada thanks the High Commissioner and the Secretary-General for the reports and support the conclusions and recommendations. We are profoundly concerned as to the ongoing violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law committed by the Russian Federation in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. We are alarmed by the transfer and forced deportation and militarization of Ukrainian children, and also by the imposition of Russian citizenship and the persistent use of torture, arbitrary detention and sexual violence. We would echo the call for free, unimpeded access of the OHCHR and other monitoring mechanisms of an international nature and regional nature to all of the temporarily occupied territories. We urge all member states to continue to work alongside us and to support efforts aiming to monitor, document and respond to these violations. Canada reiterates its unwavering support to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine and shall continue to defend justice, accountability and the protection of all victims. Madam Assistant Secretary-General, what efforts are being deployed for the United Nations to have access to the temporarily occupied zones? Thank you.
Thank you very much. North Macedonia is next.
Madam Vice President, North Macedonia remains deeply concerned by the grave and persistent violations of international human rights and humanitarian law outlined in the Secretary-General's report on the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, including Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. The report details systemic abuses of the occupying authorities of the Russian Federation, including forced citizenship, conscription, arbitrary detention, torture, and enforced disappearances. The continued transfer of Ukrainian detainees, including children, to Russian territory is a clear violation of the international law. Freedom of expression, religion, and association is being suppressed, particularly targeting Crimean Tatars, journalists, and human rights defenders. Ukrainian institutions are being dismantled and property rights eroded to facilitate demographic changes. North Macedonia joins the Secretary-General in calling for immediate, unfettered access for independent international monitoring mechanisms to all occupied territories, the cessation of all violations, and full accountability for those responsible. We reaffirm our unwavering support for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. And I give the floor to Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Slovenia aligns with the EU statement. We thank the SG and the OHCR for the update. While we welcome the exchanges of prisoners of war, we remain deeply concerned by reports of torture and other forms of cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment, sexual violence, and of arbitrary detention of civilians, including journalists. Such acts constitute clear violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. They must cease immediately, and those responsible must be held accountable. We reiterate that forcible transfer or deportation of protected persons from occupied territory are prohibited under IHL. All protected persons, among them children, previously transferred within or out of the illegally and temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine must return to their homes. We call on the Russian Federation to refrain from making any changes to the personal status of the forcibly transferred Ukrainian children. All measures in this regard are unacceptable, illegal, and must stop. Slovenia reaffirms its unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We will continue to stand for protection and respect of human rights of all civilians unjustly swept into this war of aggression. I thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. I now give the floor to the delegation of Eritrea.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. My delegation takes note of the oral presentation by the High Commissioner and the interim report of the Secretary-General on the human rights situation in Ukraine, including references to Crimea. We underscore the need for all UN reporting and engagement to be guided by the principles of impartiality, objectivity, and respect for sovereignty. The decision of the people of Crimea in 2014 to reunify with the Russian Federation was the result of a democratic process and a legitimate expression of popular will. This reality, however inconvenient to some, should not be dismissed or misrepresented. It is unacceptable to subject Crimea, an integral part of the Russian Federation, to scrutiny within the framework of another state's internal affairs. We are deeply concerned that this agenda item is being instrumentalized for political purposes that undermine the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Russian Federation. We therefore call for adherence to the United Nations Charter and for an end to the practice of selectivity targeting states, including Russia, under the pretext of human rights through unbalanced and biased reporting that does not reflect the realities on the ground. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. And I give the floor to the delegation of Malta.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Malta aligns itself with the statement of the EU and thanks the Secretary-General for his report. We remain gravely concerned by the continuing deterioration of the human rights situation in Crimea, as documented in the report. We note with deep concern the patterns of intimidation, arbitrary arrests, and prosecutions targeting those who express dissenting views, particularly members of the Crimean Tatar community. The use of Russian Federation legislation in the occupied territory, including to restrict freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association, is contrary to international law. We echo the Secretary-General's call for the full respect of international human rights and humanitarian law, and for the immediate and unconditional release of those arbitrarily detained. We reiterate the importance of full unimpeded access for international and regional human rights monitoring mechanisms to Crimea, in line with General Assembly resolutions and recommendations of the UN human rights system. Malta reaffirms its support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We call for the protection of civilians and for accountability for all violations and abuses of human rights. I thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Spain.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. Spain adds its voice to what was said by the EU and thanks the Secretariat for their report. I don't think we could enrich the debate by adding more description of the atrocities perpetrated by Russia in Ukraine territory, including the total range of human rights violations. But I would like to share with you two thoughts. The first is that the absence of Russia is a lack of respect this afternoon here in the Council, and a clear sign of its lack of willingness to cooperate and a determination to use the institution for spurious reasons and to manipulate it. That was number two. The credibility of this Council is often attacked because we supposedly have double standards. But I would like to ask the ASG if, beyond the specificities of each context, and I'm sure they exist, can you identify patterns or parallels of systematic human rights violations in the context of alien or foreign occupation? On the one hand, the occupation of Ukrainian territories by Russia, and on the other, the occupation by Israel of Palestinian territories. Thank you very much indeed.
Muchas gracias, embajador.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, says the Vice President. I now give the floor to the Netherlands.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the Assistant Secretary-General for the update and the presentation of the Secretary-General's report. More than 3 years since Russia's illegal and unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and more than 11 years after its annexation of Crimea, Russia continues to rip Ukrainians from their identity, culture, and land. For the 12th time already, the UNSG's report details human rights violations committed by Russia in the temporarily occupied territories, including in Crimea. We strongly condemn the torture, ill treatment, sexual violence, arbitrary detention, attempts at Russification, and the forcible transfer and deportation of civilians, including children, as described in the Secretary-General's report. The report also makes clear that violations identified in previous reports have not been investigated or prosecuted by the Russian authorities. Instead, legislation has been adopted granting immunity to perpetrators of human rights violations. This underlines the need to support efforts at the international level to bring perpetrators to justice. The Netherlands will remain committed to restore justice for the people of Ukraine. Madam ASG, what can be done to provide support to children who have been in Russian so-called patriotic military training? Thank you.
Muchas gracias. A continuación.
Thank you very much. I now call the Ambassador of Portugal.
Muchas gracias, señora vicepresidenta. Portugal welcomes the Assistant Secretary-General's presentation of the Secretary-General's interim report. We commend the ongoing efforts to shed light on Russia's systematic violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, despite its lack of cooperation. We remain concerned by the widespread repression of fundamental freedoms. The reports of arbitrary detention, torture, enforced disappearances, and forced conscription are unacceptable. As evidenced by the accounts of persecution against journalists, lawyers, civil society actors and Crimean Tatars, there is a pattern of targeted discrimination and intimidation by Russian authorities. We are appalled by the documented cases of forced transfer and deportation of Ukrainian children. Equally troubling are the reported violations of the right to education, including the imposition of Russian curricula and restrictions on the Ukrainian language. We urge the Russian Federation to end its occupation and to comply with its international obligations to ensure unimpeded access to monitoring mechanisms. Portugal reaffirms its commitment to accountability and justice for all victims, as well as its support to the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Gracias, señora vicepresidenta.
Gracias, embajador.
Thank you, Ambassador. I now give the floor to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Vice President, Agenda Item 10 of the Human Rights Council was conceived to address technical assistance and capacity building for countries concerned in order to contribute to improving the situation of human rights on the ground in line with the principles of genuine dialogue and cooperation, taking into account national needs and priorities. However, this debate and related resolution distort the essential mandate of technical assistance, capacity building, and reduce increasingly into establishing a scenario of instrumentalization for the geopolitical interests of specific group. This is obvious manifestation of politicization and double standards. This selective and discriminatory practice should not be continued. Furthermore, all reports before the HRC should be based on objective, balanced, and impartial assessments on the ground. Politically motivated initiatives or unbalanced and biased approaches are not conducive but counterproductive to the dialogue and cooperation for the promotion and protection of human rights. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. A continuación.
Thank you very much. I now call the delegation of Australia.
Thank you, Vice President. More than 3 years on, we continue to see Russia's blatant disregard for its international humanitarian law and international human rights law obligations. Amid the countless violations outlined, Australia remains deeply concerned by your reports of Russia's violations of the rights of prisoners of war, including widespread and systematic torture and ill treatment. We are appalled by the deportations of Ukrainian children by Russia. We are also alarmed at Russia's abhorrent and ongoing missile strikes on Ukraine. Any direct targeting of civilians is a violation of international humanitarian law. Civilian casualties are increasing at an alarming rate. These attacks demonstrate Russia is not serious about wanting to end its illegal and immoral war. The OHCHR's documentation of human rights violations is essential to efforts to hold Russia accountable for its brutal invasion. Australia supports Ukraine's right to defend itself, which is why we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. We call on Russia to comply with its international human rights obligations, engage with negotiations in good faith, and fulfil any commitments made. Madam Assistant Secretary-General, how can we ensure accountability for Russia's violations of international law and the generational toll of this war? Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Greece. You have the floor.
Madam Vice President, Greece aligns with the EU statement and thanks the Assistant Secretary-General for her update. We express our serious concern for the findings of both reports and the continuous widespread violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law committed by Russia in the framework of its war of aggression against Ukraine. We remain gravely concerned by the high numbers of civilian casualties from systematic drone attacks and attacks on hospitals, energy, and other civilian infrastructure by Russia. We are equally alarmed by the situation in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Reports indicate numerous cases of torture, ill treatment, sexual violence, and forced disappearances, arbitrary arrest, and detention. Ukrainian children are reported to have been forcibly transferred within these territories or deported to the Russian Federation. We are deeply troubled by reports of military training programs and prospects of future military service for children in these areas. We underline the urgent need to ensure safe return and family reunification for all affected children. We reiterate the importance of ensuring accountability for all violations and call on the Russian Federation to comply fully with its obligations under international law. Finally, we reiterate our support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders and for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in line with the principles of the UN Charter and international law. I thank you.
Gracias, embajador.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador of Belgium, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. My delegation aligns itself with the EU statement. Belgium firmly condemns Russia's unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine, as well as its ongoing violations of international humanitarian and human rights law committed in complete impunity. Russia's escalating and systematic attacks on residential areas and civilian infrastructure clearly demonstrates its continued lack of sincerity regarding any path towards peace. While we welcome the recent exchange of prisoners, we remain deeply concerned about those still held in Russian captivity. We call for the immediate return of all prisoners of war, unlawfully detained civilians and children who have been unlawfully deported or forcibly transferred. We are equally alarmed by the coercion of residents in Russian-occupied territories into accepting Russian citizenship and by systematic indoctrination of children. Russia must immediately end its war of aggression, withdraw unconditionally from the entire territory of Ukraine, and put an end to the unbearable suffering it continues to cause. Belgium remains fully committed to a just and lasting peace grounded in international law and full accountability for war crimes and other grave violations. Madam ASG, what more can the international community do to ensure the protection and return of Ukrainian children who have been unlawfully deported or forcibly transferred, and to hold all those responsible at every level fully accountable? I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador. Uruguay, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. We're grateful for the High Commission's oral update and the presentation of the report of the Secretary-General, interim one. We are concerned about the international human rights law, international humanitarian law, international laws, violations by the Russian Federation on Ukrainian territories temporarily occupied. Documented in this report, we appeal to the parties to ensure that UNHCR, the regional mechanisms, regional human rights monitoring mechanisms, can have unfettered access to Ukraine's territories occupied temporarily, to permit the effective application of the UN resolutions. We reiterate the need for accountability for the serious international law crimes committed in Crimea in Ukrainian territory. We return our firm support to the sovereign integrity of Ukraine within its internationally established borders, and we appeal to the Russian Federation to fully abide throughout the territory with its obligations under international law and international humanitarian law. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. The Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, you have the floor. Thank you, Madam Vice President. The agenda item 10 was designed to tackle technical assistance and capacity building to improve human rights situations in the countries concerned with their cooperation. Through dialogue and cooperation, we deplore the fact that under item 10, initiatives far from these clear parameters have been promoted, which is precisely what caused the demise of the now defunct Human Rights Commission. We reiterate the fact that politicization, selectivity and double standards do not contribute in any way to the promotion and protection of human rights and in no way benefit vulnerable people or persons. Madam Vice President, we deplore the fact that Ukraine has become an instrument for the expansion of NATO, putting at risk the human rights of all its people, to foster aggression against Russia in an attempt to expand the strategic lines of this military alliance. This aggression is reflected inter alia in an increase of anti-Russian sentiment, attacks against the Orthodox Church and its faithful, and the growing practice of torture, including for foreign journalists. Venezuela, a firm defender of the UN Charter, will always advocate for dialogue to guarantee peace. This was the last speaker we could accommodate. We move on now to NHRIs and NGOs.
Cedo entonces la palabra a Ukrainian Parliament
Commission for Human Rights. You have the floor.
Secretary-General, participants, I would like to thank you for important work and systematic reporting. For 11 years, the Russian Federation has grossly violated human rights in our country. Killings, deportations, torture, sexual violence, unlawful detentions, and executions have become widespread phenomenon. The civilian population is the main target. Russia systematically shells civilian infrastructure. People are killed and injured daily because of the aggression of Russian Federation. Among them are innocent children. That is why I call on the Office of the High Commissioner and the Monitoring Mission to continue and strengthen their efforts to protect human rights in Ukraine, namely, to highlight in reports the systematic shelling of civilian infrastructure and other crimes committed by the aggressor state, to conduct monitoring visits to places of illegal detention on the territory of Russia and demands access to them, to urge stronger international diplomatic and sanctions pressure on Russia to stop the crimes. Human rights must be protected and international humanitarian law must be respected.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. War Resisters International is next.
WRI, together with its partner Connection EV, expresses its solidarity with the people of Ukraine suffering from the military aggression of the Russian Federation and call for an immediate ceasefire and peace negotiation. We raise concerns about the Russian Federation forcibly imposing military registration and conscription in occupied territories, pressuring civilians to sign military contracts, and indoctrinating children militaristically. In Crimea, 4 Jehovah's Witnesses have been imprisoned, and illegal mobilization produced over 500 criminal cases. Russian soldiers mobilized in the self-proclaimed republics in eastern Ukraine are unable to refuse military service. In the event of desertion, they face criminal prosecution in Russia and suspicion of treason from the Ukrainian side. As a result, they have virtually no opportunity to apply for asylum in a safe country, and their relocation is nearly impossible. In Ukraine, there are still no effective procedures for conscience objection claims and exemption from military duty. 15 prisoners of conscience detained in prisons and military units, as reported by ECHO, should be released, and objector accused of draft evasion acquitted. The lack of recognition of the human right to conscience objection has also been reported in the OHCHR periodic report, as well as 8 cases of torture and ill treatment of conscience objectors and pressure by military recruiters on members of the legal profession. We urge the full implementation of the human right to refuse military service. We hope the Constitutional Court of Ukraine will promptly satisfy complaints of conscience objectors Dmitry Zelensky and Vitaly Alexeyenko and acquit Vitaly Krushenko. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor to Conscience and Peace Tax International, CPTI.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chairman. Madam ASG, while upholding Ukraine in the face of continued Russian aggression, what can its friends do to persuade it to adhere to its own human rights obligations? We await anxiously the Constitutional Court decision on the complaint lodged by Dmytro Zelensky regarding the non-availability during martial law of alternative civilian service for conscientious objectors to military service, on which hinges nothing less than a right which inheres in the freedom of thought, conscience and religion guaranteed by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and which, as we have heard already, is also being disregarded by Russia. In March this year, over a dozen Ukrainian conscientious objectors were under sentence of 3 years' imprisonment for their refusal of military service. No less than 182 further cases were currently before the courts, and more than 500 criminal investigations were underway on Jehovah's Witnesses alone. Other objectors, having been forcibly recruited, were facing even harsher military penalties for disobedience. Unless the Constitutional Court halts this trend, as we fervently hope it does, the number of imprisoned objectors will by the end of the year be in the hundreds. This, we must point out, would constitute a repression of minority beliefs on almost a Russian scale. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to World Federation of Ukrainian Women's Organizations.
We thank the High Commissioner and the Secretary-General for the reports. We are gravely concerned about the continued and massive aerial attacks on Ukraine by the Russian Federation. The intensified use of long-range missiles and systematic drone strikes have led to a dramatic 50% increase in civilian casualties this year. We condemn in the strongest of terms these actions, including the deliberate targeting of residential areas and civilian infrastructure, transportation networks, and emergency and rescue services. Widespread and systematic use of enforced disappearances and torture in occupied territories must stop. The international community and this Council must intensify efforts to secure the release of all Ukrainian civilians unlawfully detained. Currently, 37,000 Ukrainians are registered missing, and 16,000 Ukrainian civilians are known to be detained by Russia, though the actual number is likely much higher. Many have been held for years without trial, subjected to torture, inhumane conditions, and unlawful transfer to the Russian Federation. The tragic case of Ukrainian journalist Viktoria Roshchina, who died in Russian captivity, showing clear signs of torture, underscores the urgency of international action. The detention of civilians is a grave violation of international law. We stress that civilians must not be included in prisoner exchanges. They must be released immediately and unconditionally. Continued efforts are necessary to ensure access to occupied territories for the monitoring of human rights. We fully support the position of the government of Ukraine in its efforts to negotiate a ceasefire and a just and lasting peace, as well as the recent establishment of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. All those responsible for the crime of aggression and war crimes must be brought to justice. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Human Rights Research League.
Thank you, Mr. President. Human Rights Research League is appalled by Russia's ongoing aggression, and as a Ukrainian journalist and human rights advocate myself, I must speak out against the horrific crimes committed by Russia in its war against Ukraine. These acts are crimes against humanity. One of the most disturbing perpetrations is Russia's systematic kidnapping of Ukrainian children from occupied territories. The children are taken from orphanages or separated from their parents and guardians, transported to Russia, stripped of their identities, and illegally adopted. This is a state-sponsored child trafficking. The ICC issued arrest warrants for war crimes for key state actors in Russia involved in these abductions. These crimes may also amount to genocide by erasing Ukrainian identity. The brutality extends to Ukrainian civilians abducted, tortured, and killed in Russian captivity. The recent murder of journalist Viktoria Roshchina, tortured and mutilated in captivity, is heartbreaking. Ukrainian prisoners of war face torture, starvation, execution, in violation of the Geneva Conventions. These abuses are systemic and approved by Russia's leadership. We stand with survivors and families demanding justice and action. The international community must hold Russia accountable, not just for past crimes, but for the ongoing aggression. Russia's war must not continue unchallenged. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. Human Rights House Foundation is next.
Thank you. We welcome the Secretary General's report and its detailed focus on the deteriorating situation in Crimea. Over a decade of occupation has produced a near total collapse of civic space in Crimea and what our partner, the Crimean Human Rights Group, calls a prison for the residents of the occupied territory. Our partner Zmina documented at least 47 new cases of pressure on professional and citizen journalists in Crimea between May 2024 and May 2025. 17 journalists remain political prisoners, among them Irina Danilovich, Remzi Bakirov, Ahmed Suleimanov, and Timur Ibrahimov require urgent care. Mr. Bakirov is repeatedly confined to a punishment cell. We call for his immediate release. Human rights lawyers and defenders are likewise targeted. Recent searches and disbarments of Crimean Tatar lawyers and the closure or sanctioning of independent media exemplify Russia's deliberate dismantling of fundamental freedoms of expression, association, and assembly. We further note with alarm the Secretary General's documentation of forced conscription and indoctrination of children, mass confiscation of property from Ukrainians who refuse Russian citizenship, and the continued denial of OHCHR and other independent monitors access to Crimea. We highlight the report's findings that such persecution is systematic, and our Ukrainian partners now make a clear case for such persecution as amounting to a potential crime against humanity. Madam Vice President, we ask the High Commissioner whether there are any remedies or reparations for the mass confiscation of property of Ukrainians in Crimea. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Civicus is next.
Mr. President, Civicus and the Center for Civil Liberties welcomes the reports of the Secretary General and the update of the High Commissioner. We remain concerned about the massive and systematic human rights violations in Crimea, including political persecution of dissent, destruction of independent media, censorship, closure of religious organizations, and discrimination against the Crimean Tatar people by the indigenous people of the peninsula. Since the occupation, the Center has been keeping reports of civil society actors and human rights defenders facing reprisals for their non-violent activities in defense of human rights. Many have been subjected to enforced disappearances, arbitrary arrest, torture, sexual and gender-based violence, and unlawful imprisonment on fabricated criminal charges, including Crimean Tatar activists, cultural leaders, journalists, and volunteers on the peninsula. We also remain gravely concerned about the forced mobilization of Ukrainian citizens into the Russian army and the relentless militarization of Crimea, as well as about the forcible displacement policy to substitute the population in Crimea with citizens of the Russian Federation. We urge states to make human rights violations and abuses occurring in occupied Crimea more visible, to support civil society with flexible and long-term funding, and to support the extension and adequate funding of international investigative efforts to ensure accountability for crimes against civil society.
Thank you very much indeed. I now give the floor for a joint statement to Lawyers for Lawyers.
Lawyers Rights Watch Canada, the International Bar Association Human Rights Institute, Frontline Defenders and the Council of Bars and Law Societies in Europe remain deeply concerned about the ongoing persecution of lawyers in occupied Crimea. Those representing Crimean Tatars, Ukrainians, and civil society actors in politically sensitive cases are systematically harassed, threatened, and prosecuted. Their homes and offices are raided, access declines in case materials obstructed, and their licenses revoked, effectively preventing them from defending political prisoners. Bar associations under the occupying authorities no longer function independently. Disciplinary bodies are routinely weaponized to interfere with lawyers' work, often at the direct request of the Russian Ministry of Justice. These politically motivated proceedings lack due process and gravely violate international standards on the independence of the legal profession. This has led to the disbarment of lawyers Lilia Hametsi, Rustem Kianiev, Natsim Shakhmambutov, and Alexei Ladin, all targeted for their legitimate work. Such harassment, along with arbitrary sanctions like fines, administrative detention, and unlawful surveillance, has deterred other lawyers from taking up certain cases, making access to independent legal representation virtually impossible, as reflected in the UN Secretary-General's report. We urge this Council to call for independent review of all disbarment cases in Crimea and other occupied territories of Ukraine, demand reinstatement of unjustly revoked licenses, and publicly condemn the misuse of legal tools to punish lawyers and human rights defenders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor to Ingénieur du Monde.
Mr. President, 1,226. That is how many days Ukraine has endured Russia's brutal and unlawful invasion. Each passing day not only claims more innocent lives, but it deepens the failure of this Council to uphold its mandate. The findings in this report by the Secretary General are abhorrent and demand immediate action by member states. Mr. President, the testimonies in this report reveal that both Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war are being raped and sexually assaulted at the hands of Russian forces. The UN has documented Ukrainian civilians dying in Russian custody after being tortured, abused, and denied even the most basic principles under international law. Ukrainian children have been stolen from their homes and transferred to Russia. Their whereabouts remain unknown as Russian authorities obstruct the efforts of the Red Cross. Meanwhile, inside Russia and across the territories it illegally occupies, fundamental freedoms of expression are under siege. Ukrainian identity is criminalized. Mr. President, the international community can no longer remain idle. Russia's aggression is not only a war on Ukraine, it is a war on human rights, on accountability, and on the very principles this Council was created to defend. 1,226 days. How many more before this Council takes decisive action? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. And I give the floor to the Next Century Foundation.
Distinguished members, the Next Century Foundation wishes to express its grave concern over the growing use of autonomous technologies in warfare. Through the conduct of the Ukraine war, we have seen a troubling rise in drone systems and artificial intelligence used in targeting and operations. Though often justified by efficiency or precision, these tools have diminished accountability and normalized remote, dehumanized conflict. Inexpensive drones have been proven highly effective in halting vehicles. Their use against individual soldiers, however, raises serious ethical concerns. These troops often have no means of defense or chance to surrender, rendering them helpless. Using such weapons in this context can be seen as disproportionate, making the battlefield deadlier for individuals. We recognize that drones and autonomous weaponry can keep combatants out of direct harm's way, and that efficiency in warfare has its place. However, the dangers of detached warfare necessitate urgent regulation. We urge the group of governmental experts to conclude formal discussions on the regulation of autonomous weapons and provide clear guidance to nations on their use through an addition to the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons covering AI and drones. We also urge states to follow these guidelines. The wielders of these weapons have a responsibility to act accordingly. clear international norms are needed to protect civilians, uphold humanitarian law, and prevent a future where machines fight with little human control. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. This was the last speaker we could accommodate in this dialogue. May I now give the floor to Ms. Brans-Keris to make her concluding observations. You have the floor, Madam.
Madam Vice President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I thank you very much for this very engaged discussion and statements, and including the many questions as well that we have received. I will attempt to cluster a little bit and answer them as far as time permits. And let me just say that while we actually were having this dialogue, the sirens went off in Kiev once again, only to show the urgency of this dialogue that we are having. Many questions centered around, and comments as well, centered around accountability. So I will start there. I will not list all the member states who had the questions. You know, you heard them all, but it was obviously a very prominent focus of many of them. We will, of course, continue to call the international community to pursue a just and sustainable peace, and that in line, as we all know, should be in line with the UN Charter and international law, and that includes the diplomacy and dialogue that we will return to. But justice and accountability for those very grave violations and war crimes committed in Ukraine that we have been discussing and that are in the reports, including in occupied territory, are of course indispensable for achieving lasting peace. And that includes ensuring accountability for all serious grave violations of human rights and humanitarian law, including conflict-related sexual violence that many of you mentioned as well. The mechanisms for justice and accountability have to have a victim-centered approach, and they should promote truth, justice, reparations as we at its center. So we encourage very much the international community to continue the efforts to support law enforcement efforts, to document, to investigate, utilizing a survivor-centered approach, and to adapt assistance to the survivors who have varying needs so that it is a targeted assistance. There is a significant number of men survivors that should also be taken into account when planning assistance programs. The capacity of Ukrainian institutions and the need to strengthen them remains on the agenda. The capacity to investigate and to prosecute violations of human rights and international humanitarian law in accordance, of course, with international standards. And that is in order to contribute to the accountability and to reinforce the independence of Ukraine's judiciary system and the rule of law in this regard. The international community should also help Ukraine to put in place measures to rebuild communities, facilitate the reintegration of persons who lived under occupation, and to foster social cohesion. And that is looking forward. We will come back very briefly to that part of the questions that some of you had as well. The human rights mechanisms documenting violations need to receive the support and the funds that also need to be there at the adequate necessary levels. And that includes, of course, also our own Office of the High Commissioner's monitoring mission in Ukraine and the Commission of Inquiry as well. There's a continued engagement with and support for international accountability mechanisms, including the International Criminal Court. That is also important. And of course, the role of all those who are engaged. Many mentioned also both the stress that civil society is under, but also the role that they need to have and the support they need to have in this regard. The access to occupied territories was mentioned several times, and there was a specific question as well, so that in this regard, it is not new, but we regret that the Russian Federation continues to deny the Office of the High Commissioner access to the occupied territory and to the Russian Federation. We, of course, continue and will continue to consistently request access in our communication with the Russian Federation, and we have also, as you will have seen, raised this issue in the public reporting that has been done. So meanwhile, while we don't have the access, we certainly remain committed to doing the monitoring and reporting on the human rights situation in the occupied territory. This is done in an independent way. It is done in an impartial way. We have, and I have mentioned, as has the High Commissioner and our other OHCHR colleagues many times, that OHCHR has a standard rigorous methodology for monitoring overall, and it includes also a methodology for remote monitoring. That means gathering and verifying information from using different sources. That includes witnesses, it includes victims, it includes satellite imagery, open source materials, but also information made available by the state authorities, but also by the occupation authorities. The issues concerning the occupied territory itself, there were questions on remedies and reparations, in particular also referring to the confiscation of property of Ukrainians, also referring specifically to Crimea, but of course there are broader issues here. We know that the Russian Federation has taken significant steps to expropriate private property in occupied territory of Ukraine. Clearly, that is in violation of international humanitarian law. Some recent confiscations have occurred mainly in Donetsk, Kherson, and Luhansk regions, but those practices began already in 2014 in Crimea, where property was sold or provided to Russian citizens and military personnel without compensation to the original owners, residents of Crimea. So in Ukraine, individuals whose property was damaged or destroyed in government-controlled territory after 2022 have access to compensation. In December 2024, the Ukrainian parliament adopted a law on compensation for property lost in occupied territory, including through confiscation, but this law has not been signed by the president and therefore has not entered into force. But that's on the Ukrainian side. And several of you mentioned on the international level, the Council of Europe established, preceding the tribunal that was referred to, there is a registry of damage to serve as a record of damage, loss and injury caused by aggression of the Russian Federation. And these mechanisms, of course, cover property confiscated by the occupation authorities, but to the properties that were lost after 24th of February 2022, specifically. So we call on the Russian Federation certainly to refrain from confiscating private property in occupied territory, and we encourage the international community, as well as Ukraine, to include people who lost their property in the occupied territory before 2022 in all compensation and reparation measures in order to ensure also the equal treatment of victims in this regard. For other issues, and there were issues concerning identity on occupied territory by several questions that were put there, in particular also the preservation of identity under the conditions of occupation. We have indeed, as an office, documented a systematic suppression of Ukrainian culture, language and identity in the occupied territory of Ukraine. Those are violations, very clear violations of an occupying power's obligations under international humanitarian law. And this, of course, is consistent in all cases. This and other violations of humanitarian law, we have the focus on the obligations of an occupying power, of course, is also in all situations where occupations are taking place. So beyond the legal implications, they also have clearly very long-term consequences. There is the social fabric issue itself, the destruction of society, of communities themselves, the fragmentation and the threat to the identities, the Ukrainian identity, community identities, the cultural heritage that risks being lost, as well as linguistic diversity, which of course we should all cherish. But this was also, many of you or several of you mentioned particularly the focus on children and youth as well. So I think this is something we need to focus on. There is a potential long-term and intergenerational effect on this pressure on Ukrainian identity and culture itself and language that needs attention. There's a climate of fear, of repression. The social divisions, of course, will only increase from those kinds of tensions, and that clearly makes any future reconciliation and reintegration much more complicated. So we encourage very much the international community to support civil society and cultural organizations to work on all of these issues and the support for Ukrainian culture and language on the occupied territory. There was a particular question concerning children, and of course in that context of education, very importantly also for that support to be targeted and to maintain also these aspects of cultural identity. And that, of course, would include also those civil society organizations that are active outside of the occupied territory, so that language, history, traditions, and other parts of identity can be preserved. We also encourage the international community to engage with the Russian Federation to urge that full compliance, as many of you did today, with international humanitarian human rights law and the implementation of the recommendations that the Office of the High Commissioner is making and that we have in the reports presented today. And there needs to be a strong international support for the accountability mechanisms as well. I already touched on that, but I would stress that that includes both international and domestic accountability measures. We have to have justice for victims and lay also the foundation as a step towards the foundation for long-term reconciliation, again with regard with taking into account the culture. I feel that I am coming to an end of what I can say, so I will be very, very quick on this one, because there's just the use of children, if I may, just I will really cut to just one sentence, but the use of children, Ukrainian children, by Russia in the context of the war of aggression is a very important issue. Many of you focused on it. We continue to very closely follow this, and also the impact in general of the ongoing conflict of children in Ukraine. Clearly, that is an issue of well-being, on the safety of children and their fundamental rights. As we know, for children, it is the interest of the child that needs to be at the center of how children are dealt with. We have the issues are in the reports that some of you referred to, that the cases of unidentified individuals who have contacted children in Ukraine through social media, partly they have been offered money to commit acts of sabotage, acts of arson and other acts of aggression, and also deployment of improvised explosive devices against Ukrainian military targets as well as civilians. And some children have been killed doing this, and in other cases they have been detained, in which case they also face very serious criminal charges. And of course this is really urging you to remember to argue for children being treated as victims and that they get the adequate protection that they need and rehabilitation. I don't have time, I think, to go through the issue. We've had it before, however, on the transferred and deported children. Just to say that we have been trying to verify these allegations. It's a complex issue. We are, of course, urging also the Russian Federation to submit information to the Central Tracing Agency about all the children evacuated and in various ways, including the forcible transfer from the territory of Ukraine to the Russian Federation. There needs to be a family-based also focus in when we are calling for the return to their families, but even in those cases where that is not possible. And finally, I don't have time for that, but we do call, of course, as always, on dialogue with the Russian Federation. There was a specific question on this. We are committed to maintain dialogue. We think that bringing information and evidence is precisely the basis for this dialogue. Indeed here, but in all other ways, really a dialogue at all levels, at the higher level, political, strategic, but also technical, that needs to be continued. And of course, human rights need to be at the central to any decision-making around the future of the Ukraine. There's much work that needs to be done. I think there's work that needs to start already now in looking for not just the future peace that has been referred to, but how to rebuild a society that is cohesive, that takes into account the rights of all persons, that goes to also the transition, taking the very severe and potentially intergenerational damage that has been done to come together. Several of you, and that I will finish, I promise, Madam Vice President, but many of you mentioned what really comes down to the diversity of society. Crimean Tatars were mentioned, other minorities also, and of course we need to go towards and support also Ukraine's path toward that strengthening of a future Ukrainian society that is inclusive, that takes into account, of course, the need for the promotion and of Ukrainian culture and language, certainly under the stress period that has happened now. But of course, it includes also the full respect for the rights of national minorities and all ethnic groups. There would be a lot more to say, but I know I already overstretched my time, and I thank you very much for your indulgence.
Agradecemos entonces a la Subsecretaria General de las Naciones Unidas para los Derechos Humanos, la señora Brands, por la presentación de su informe y sus comentarios finales. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed, which brings us to the end of this interactive dialogue. Without further ado, without pause, we will move straight on to our next topic, if you will agree, ladies and gentlemen. So we move on to our interactive dialogue on the report of the High Commissioner on the improvement of technical assistance and capacity building in Colombia, and this pursuant to Resolution 53/22 of this Council. As you know, the list of speakers, that is, will close in 15 minutes. It's an honor for me now to give the floor to Ms. Marit Kohonen Sharif, Director of the Global Operations Division of OHHR, for her presentation. You have the floor, Madam.
Presidenta, Excellencias.
Thank you, Madam Vice President, or distinguished participants. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to the Council to present the report of the High Commissioner on technical cooperation of its Colombia office. The initiative behind this resolution attests to the firm commitment of the government of Colombia to human rights, the search for peace, and close cooperation with the OHCHR. The work of our office in Colombia has been comprehensive. It has coordinated monitoring, technical cooperation, and strategic support. However, since July 2023, the ability of our office to provide all the technical assistance provided for in the resolutions of this Council has been limited because of the liquidity crisis of the ordinary budget for the Secretariat of the United Nations. Furthermore, in 2025, we found that a number of donors either ended or significantly reduced their financial contributions. As a consequence, we will have to close 3 field offices, Medellin, Neiva, and Villavicencio, and make redundant almost half of our staff, 46 members of staff. We made this situation public last week, and since then different sectors have voiced their concern about the closure of the 3 offices. We've already seen concrete examples of the negative impact of the financial cuts. Let me give you a few examples. Indigenous women with whom we have worked have literally cried when they saw that our office in Neva was closed. They told us, "You're leaving us all alone. You are the only ones who can help us to recover our children out of the clutches of the armed groups." Second, our protection has been reduced in areas where armed non-state actors represent a threat for human rights defenders. A third example, we've reduced our efforts with communities to prevent the recruitment of boys and girls. And fourth, we've had to reduce our technical assistance to the police force to prevent the excessive use of force. Whilst the challenges remain, there are also tangible results. Let me just give you a few concrete examples which the High Commissioner's report lists. In 2024, we made progress in following up on 104 recommendations prioritized by the Truth Commission. Furthermore, we launched a joint public dissemination campaign to raise the visibility of the 222 recommendations made by the Commission. Through our support, the support of the special peace jurisdictions, we supported crucial investigations on extrajudicial killings, sexual violence and forced recruitment. Also, we helped victims and other people due to appear in court to prepare their appearance in court. Madam Vice President, now technical assistance and efforts to prevent human rights violations are increasingly sought after as we see a rise in violence and a rise in pre-electoral tensions. The territorial and social control of armed state, non-state actors and criminal organizations continue to affect the rights of civilians in a number of areas, in particular affecting women, girls and boys, as well as indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant and peasant communities. For example, on the 11th of June, over 20 indiscriminate attacks were perpetrated in the county of Cauca, killing 8 people and injuring at least 83. Also, we have pre-electoral violence. In this context, on the 7th of June, there was an attack against Mr. Miguel Uribe Turbay, who is a senator and a presidential pre-candidate who is currently in intensive care. Between the 1st of January and the 25th of June this year, we received allegations of 84 homicides or killings of human rights defenders, out of which we verified 20 cases. The report restates that only through the comprehensive implementation of the peace agreement, as well as transitional justice and the protection of human rights defenders, will we be able to consolidate real guarantees of non-reoccurrence. As part of what we do to prevent human rights violations, our office has continued to provide technical assistance to the Ministry of Defence and to the National Police Force to reform doctrines, embody international standards, and improve their proportional use of force. Another example, over 700 human rights recommendations were included in the educational doctrine of the National Police Force in the training of their police officers. We also drove forward Presidential Decree 1231 of 2024, which embodies once again international human rights standards in the doctrine used for the use of force during demonstrations. The participation of victims have been supported by our office also through, for example, their involvement in the human rights platforms, which are crucial for the government's design of national policies to provide guarantees for human rights defenders. To conclude, Madam Vice President, we reiterate our appeal to the international community to ensure proper support to OHCHR so it can continue to play the unique and essential role it is playing in Colombia, namely to provide support and technical assistance to the country. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Microphone for the President, please. Microphone for the Chair. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia. Ambassador, you have 5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Vice President. Colombia is thankful for the presentation of the High Commissioner and recognizes the valuable commitment of his office to our country. For 28 years, the office has worked in our country, and especially since July 2023, to implement Resolution 5322 of this Human Rights Council. And this, despite that not all resources set aside for it have been received. As rightly said in the report, Colombia has adopted 212 indicators to monitor the progress made in the 73 recommendations from the Truth Commission, out of the 104 which were given priority to assistance provided by the Office to the Unit for the Implementation of the Peace Agreement and to the Ministry of Justice, made it possible to embody in these indicators a human rights-based approach. Equally important has been the support to the Committee for the Monitoring and Follow-up of the Implementation stemming from the Truth Commission through the dissemination of its mandate and its reports. In April this year, we launched a national campaign to disseminate the 220 recommendations made by the Truth Commission. The report underscores or highlights the technical assistance provided by the Office on 3 recommendations, namely investigations of serious human rights violations and breaches of international humanitarian law, 2, the reform of the security sector, and 3, protection to human rights defenders and social leaders. This cooperation has been especially valuable in providing support to the transitional justice mechanisms, such as the Special Jurisdictions for Peace and the Unit for the Search of Disappeared Persons, as well as for the support provided to these bodies in emblematic cases related to extrajudicial killings and the killing of human rights defenders. Also, technical assistance provided to the National Commission for the security guarantees, to the Ministry of Defense and to the National Police and to the Congress has been crucial to help them devise public policies to dismantle criminal organizations, to reform the Intelligence Act, and to consolidate an institutional doctrine which has a human rights-based approach, which is based on human rights. Also essential in the process to construct our national policy for human rights defenders, as well as the strengthening of the municipal oversight bodies in the revision of the individual and collective protection models. The implementation of the peace agreements and the recommendations stemming from the Truth Commission require a sustained and long-term effort by all. That is why it is crucial that this Council continues supporting the strengthening of the technical assistance powers of the Office on the ground in our country, and in particular, given the current context characterized by an uncertain international environment and characterized by serious violent acts such as the heinous attack of a presidential pre-candidate on the 7th of June in Bogota. To make progress more effectively in the promotion and protection of human rights in Colombia, what is urgent is that we build a peace culture pursuant to what is provided for in Resolution 5322. What is important is that the Office be given the means to design and develop a culture of peace policy, which would replace our culture of war, which has prevailed in our society because of our domestic conflict, as recommended by the Truth Commission. Colombia, in this session of the Council, has submitted a draft resolution to give continuity to Resolution 5322 in connection with 5 recommendations made by the Truth Commission, which are the 4 I've already mentioned, and a new one, namely a review of our drugs policy to provide economic, social and health measures to the consumers of drugs and the producers of drugs, instead of criminalizing them, because these are people are bent on considering these as unlawful. We should focus on neutralizing the major producers of narco traffic, which is a fuel for armed conflict in our territory. Its dismantling, with the support of the Human Rights Council and the OHCHR, is necessary if we want to make progress towards achieving peace in Colombia. We respectfully invite the members of the Council and member states who are observers to the Council to support this initiative by reaffirming with them the commitment under the Agenda Item 10 as a fundamental pillar of the Council for the promotion and protection of human rights. With your valuable support, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, High Commissioner, Vice President of the Human Rights Council, we will continue to make progress to reach everything that is within our grasp to leave behind the hell that has been gripping us. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, embajador.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador. The list of speakers is now closed, and this was the last speaker we could accommodate for today. So, distinguished colleagues, we've come to the end of this meeting, the 28th. We will meet tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. sharp with the interactive dialogue on the improvement of technical assistance in Colombia, the same as what we've just been doing. We will then have the annual roundtable on technical cooperation and capacity building, which will be followed by the interactive dialogue on the report of the High Commissioner on the... I've lost my place. I seem to be repeating myself. And the interactive dialogue on the oral update to the independent expert on the Central African Republic. This brings us to the end of the 28th meeting of the 59th session of the Human Rights Council. Thank you very much indeed. Have a very good evening, all of you.
Dios. El tiempo. Bueno. No, yo menos. O sea, perdón.